Welcome to Paranoia Night's Tales, where the dark is patient, the quiet is gentle, and every story carries you towards sleep without asking anything from you except the simple act of drifting. And tonight, we follow Cole Marrow, a man who never truly chose the night shift at the thermal reserve as much as it chose him, calling him back again and again with a kind of hush that felt older than anything he could name. Cole stepped out of his car the way someone steps into a memory they don't fully recognize but somehow trust, his boots pressing into the gravel with soft, cushioned crunches that disappeared almost instantly into the open field stretching around the facility. A field so wide and unbothered it seemed to let the night settle into every blade of dry grass, letting the cold air wrap gently around his jacket and collar without urgency or bite, just a slow, familiar presence. He stood still for a long moment, not because he needed to gather himself, but because this pause was part of his ritual, a tiny sliver of stillness he had repeated so many times. It now felt as natural as breathing, and in that moment of standing there, with the amber lamp above the door humming faintly, he let his breath slip out of him in a long, steady stream that softened something deep inside his chest, the kind of softening that only happens when you are standing in a place that has remembered you longer than you've remembered yourself. Cole lifted his head slightly, not to search the darkness, but to listen to it, a habit he had never bothered to explain to anyone because there were no proper words for the way silence here carried different textures each night. The way it pressed lightly or drifted loosely, or held itself still as if waiting to be acknowledged. And he liked recognizing these tiny differences, liked knowing the quiet wasn't empty, but layered, patient, almost companion-like in its presence. The amber lamp flickered just once, a slow, tired blink, before settling back into its warm glow. And Cole smiled at that tiny inconsistency, because even the lights at this place behaved like old things, things that had lived through countless nights and countless keepers, long before he first set foot here, and maybe long after he was gone. He began walking toward the door, and each step made the gravel shift in a gentle, muted rhythm, a rhythm that matched the calm inside his chest. And for a moment, he remembered something he once told a new hire, a young man who lasted only 3 nights before deciding the job wasn't for him. Cole had said, in the soft, even tone he used for truths rather than instructions, "People think the fire takes things away, but what remains after the burn, that is what matters." The young man had blinked, confused, expecting a technical explanation, but Cole had simply gone back to his work because he knew the meaning wasn't something you understood with facts, but with nights, many nights, spent inside quiet rooms where heat and transformation shared the same slow breath. As Cole reached the door, he placed his fingertips on its cool metal frame, the way someone might touch the shoulder of an old friend, not affectionately, not emotionally, but with a steady familiarity that made the gesture feel natural. And he could almost feel the way the building eased around him, the way its presence seemed to shift in recognition, as though it adjusted its breathing to match his. He knew that sounded strange, but in the deep hours of the night, when the entire facility was wrapped in its own ancient hush, the place often felt alive. Not alive like a creature, but alive like a memory, like a quiet awareness that simply noticed him. Before pushing the door open, he allowed himself one more slow breath, letting the crisp night air fill him and leave him without resistance, washing out the remnants of the day, clearing away the unnecessary thoughts that did not belong in the ritual spaces inside. In that breath, the familiar question drifted into him again, not sharp, not demanding, not even curious in the usual sense, just present, like dust suspended in a beam of amber light. After the burn, what remains? Cole did not answer it. He had long stopped trying to. The question had become more of a companion than a puzzle, something that simply floated at the edges of his awareness each night, whispering through the quiet hallways and settling into the warm spaces of the chamber long before the ignition ever hummed to life. He pressed the door open with the gentlest push, and it moved with the slow compliance of something old, the hinges releasing a low, softened sigh that blended seamlessly with the hush of the hallway beyond. The interior light activated not in a single flash, but in a long, gradual blooming, starting from a faint dimness and spreading outward like a rising breath until the corridor was filled with a muted glow that clung to the walls like warm dust, revealing the familiar textures Cole had come to know better than the lines of his own hands. The hallway felt exactly as it always did, calm, slow, deliberate, with the faint scent of metal and stone lingering in the air like a memory that never fully left. Cole stepped inside and let the door close behind him, the soft latch sealing him into the quiet with the same tender certainty of a blanket being pulled over someone who has already begun to fall asleep. As he walked forward, his footsteps softened even further, absorbed by the thick flooring, and he felt the night shift settling onto his shoulders in its usual way, a weight that wasn't heavy, just familiar, like the gentle pressure of a hand guiding him deeper into the place he belonged. Somewhere far down the hall, the faint hum of dormant machinery rested beneath the air like a sleeping heartbeat, slow and steady, the kind of sound that could lull even the most restless mind. Cole listened to it the way someone listens to a river they've crossed 1,000 times, knowing its flow, its rhythm, its temperament, and there was comfort in that recognition, a comfort that reached deep into him and loosened something that often felt knotted during the day. He continued walking, letting his fingertips brush the wall as he passed, feeling the familiar coolness of the smooth surface, feeling the tiny imperfections, the subtle dips, the soft ridges left by years of maintenance and quiet hands. This place had been tended by many keepers before him. Some he knew, most he didn't, but the walls held their presence all the same, absorbing each passing night into a long, silent archive of patience. Cole was part of that archive now, another keeper in a lineage that stretched further back than any instruction manual or schedule log cared to mention. And sometimes when the night was particularly still, he felt the echo of those past hands, not as ghosts, not as memories, but as a soft continuity, a sense that the quiet here had been shaped by generations of steady breaths and deliberate steps. As he approached the first junction in the hallway, the hum beneath the air shifted slightly, a subtle note rising and falling like the inhale before a whisper, and Cole paused, recognizing the shift not as a warning, but as a greeting. The building always changed its sounds in tiny, almost imperceptible ways, each variation carrying a different texture of quiet. And tonight's quiet had a softness to it, the kind that followed days of rain or long stretches of cold, the kind that made the air feel heavier, yet somehow gentler against the skin. He let his hand fall to his side, exhaled another slow breath, and felt himself settle fully into the rhythm of the night shift. Everything outside this building faded, thoughts, obligations, the noise of daytime life, and only the quiet remained, stretching out before him like a long, dimly lit path that belonged only to him. And somewhere down that path, beyond the hum, beyond the warm lights, beyond the waiting chamber, the question drifted again, softer this time, almost kind. After the burn, what remains? Cole didn't answer. He simply walked deeper into the familiar quiet, letting the night envelop him with its slow, ancient calm. Cole reached the end of the corridor, where a small square window sat inset into the wall, offering a dim view of the outer yard. The glass was old enough to carry a faint distortion along its edges, bending the amber exterior light into slow, drifting streaks that reminded him of the way heat shimmered above the chamber when the ignition had been running for hours. And he stood there for a moment, letting his eyes soften as the shapes on the other side blurred into a gentle haze. He liked these moments, the quiet pauses between actions, the still pockets of time that belonged only to him and the building. Tiny spaces where the night seemed to settle its weight on his shoulders just enough to ease everything inside him without pressing too hard. He turned left and followed the hallway that led toward the preparation wing, his footsteps fallen into a pace so slow and consistent it almost didn't feel like walking anymore, more like drifting, as though the air itself guided him forward. The hum beneath the floor deepened slightly as he approached the heart of the facility, that part of the structure where pipes and vents interwove like quiet arteries. And even though the chamber was not active yet, its presence was always there, a sleeping warmth, a dormant pulse that seemed to breathe in its own rhythm. Cole always noticed this, even when others didn't. Some keepers went years without ever tuning into the subtle shifts of the building. But for him, it had become second nature, a kind of listening that required no effort. As he reached the preparation room door, he slowed instinctively, lifting a hand to rest against the frame before entering, not to steady himself, but to greet the space in the same way he had greeted the outer door. The metal was cool beneath his fingertips, faintly textured from years of gentle cleaning, and he let his thumb trace a small arc along the edge, a motion so practiced it felt like muscle memory now. He didn't know when that habit began, maybe after his first winter shift, maybe after one of the long nights when the world outside felt too loud, and he never questioned it, because it made sense in the way rituals often made sense, quietly, without explanation. He pushed the door open and stepped into the preparation room, letting the warm, muted light settle over him like a slow breath. The air inside carried the familiar scent of steel, citrus cleanser, and a faint undertone of something older, something that clung to the walls no matter how many times they were wiped down. A scent that wasn't unpleasant but carried a kind of patience, the smell of work done carefully, repeatedly, over years. The stainless steel counters reflected the dim overhead light in soft glints rather than sharp flashes, as if even the reflections here understood the need to remain gentle. Cole walked toward the central table and set his gloves down with a soft, deliberate tap, the sound barely noticeable, but deeply familiar in the quiet. He traced the edge of the table with the back of his knuckles, feeling the tiny chill of the metal seep into his skin. And he allowed himself a moment of stillness, that same steady moment he always took before beginning the ritual of the night. It wasn't about bracing himself, it was about aligning with the room, with its slow rhythm, with the unspoken rules that governed the work done here. The quiet in this room was different from the hallway's quiet. It had density, a warmth beneath it, a sense that each breath, each small movement, contributed to a long line of nights stretching back beyond Cole's memory. He reached for the overhead switch and flicked it to its first setting, allowing the light to shift into a deeper amber tone, softer and lower, casting long, gentle shadows across the walls. Shadows in this room were never sharp. They stretched and softened, like fabric pulled slowly between careful fingers. And Cole found comfort in the way they moved. Never sudden, never strong, always part of the room's slow exhale. He leaned slightly against the edge of the table and let his eyes wander across the shelves, taking in the neatly stacked cloths, the labeled bins, the arranged tools, and the small, nearly invisible imperfections that had accumulated over the years. Tiny scratches, faint discolorations, marks left behind by hands that had worked here long before his. This room had been shaped by dozens of keepers, each one adding a subtle adjustment, a slightly different angle for the brush rack, a new fold pattern for the cotton sheets, a preferred position for the water basin. None of those changes were documented, yet all of them remained, preserved not through memory, but through repetition. And Cole liked that, liked knowing that he was part of lineage of quiet hands who had tended to the same small details night after night. He stepped toward the basin, turning the faucet just enough to let warm water flow in a thin, steady ribbon, the stream releasing a soft hush that blended perfectly with the room's ambient tone. Steam rose in slow curls, barely visible, catching the amber light in faint glimmers that drifted upward before dissolving into the air. Cole dipped his fingers beneath the stream, feeling the warmth slip along his skin, and he allowed himself to focus entirely on that single sensation. The gentle heat, the slow movement of water, the faint tingling in his fingertips, as if the entire night hinged on this quiet moment of contact. He cupped his hands beneath the stream, letting the water pool and spill through the gaps between his fingers, then reached for a clean cloth, dipping it slowly until the fabric darkened and softened. The cloth moved with a slight weight when he lifted it, heavy with warmth, and he held it for a breath before folding it neatly in half, then half again, each fold deliberate, patient, forming a small square that fit perfectly into his palm. He pressed the cloth to the table, wiping in long, even strokes, each movement following the grain of the steel, as if the table itself guided the path of the cloth. The warmth of the fabric seeped into his hand, and he let the motion become automatic, slow, steady, rhythmic. He wasn't cleaning away dirt, there never was much to clean, but preparing the surface was part of the ritual, part of the process that aligned his mind with the work ahead. As the cloth glided across the table, he let his thoughts drift, not freely, but softly, in that controlled way he had learned to cultivate over the years, a way that allowed his mind to quiet without emptying completely. And somewhere inside that drifting, the question surfaced again, its edges soft and familiar. After the burn, what remains? The words didn't arrive sharply. They rose like mist, like the slow curl of steam from the cloth, and Cole felt the weight of them settle in the quiet space behind his ribs. Not heavy, not troubling, just present. He didn't chase the question, never had. It wasn't meant to be solved, only acknowledged, like a companion that walked beside him each night, steady and wordless. He folded the cloth once more, placed it neatly at the edge of the table, and exhaled, letting the breath lengthen until it matched the slow hum of the building's dormant machinery. The room felt warmer now, not physically, but atmospherically, the air gathering around him with a softness that made the edges of the world seem slightly blurred, slightly more distant, as though the night itself was drawing him deeper into its calm. Cole reached for his gloves again, not to put them on yet, but to feel their familiar weight, the faint texture along their cuffs, and in that small, simple gesture, he felt the shift, the moment when the beginning of the night truly began, when preparation became presence, and presence became the quiet work he had come here to do. The door eased shut behind Cole with a soft padded click, and the outside night dropped away, as if someone had folded a curtain between him and the field, leaving him wrapped in a quieter kind of darkness, a darkness that didn't feel empty but held, one that carried the memory of countless nights exactly like this one, each layered over the last in a slow, careful stack. The corridor ahead of him glowed with that half-awake light he had come to trust, the motion sensors taking their time to respond, brightening in gentle increments rather than all at once, as if the building understood that abruptness had no place here. First, a faint strip of pale yellow along the ceiling, then a softening of shadows along the floor, and finally, a full, steady wash of amber that hugged the walls and left no harsh corners. Cole let his eyes move slowly, not scanning, not searching, just noticing, and as they adjusted, the familiar lines of the hallway resolved into view, the slightly rounded edges of the baseboards, the faint scuffs low along the walls where carts had brushed by, the quiet sheen of carefully maintained floors that caught the light in broad, muted strokes. He took a few steps forward, and each step landed without urgency, his boots making a gentle pressure that seemed to sink into the flooring rather than echo off it, and he could feel himself easing into the rhythm he only ever found here, a rhythm made of long breaths, slow motions, and silence that didn't demand to be broken. On his right, a series of doors passed by. Storage, maintenance, a small office no one used at night. And each one had its own way of catching the light, its own faint pattern of wear around the handle, its own small story in the form of scratches and touched paint and slightly dulled metal. Cole had walked this hallway so many times that he could have traced each detail in his mind with perfect accuracy. Yet the act of seeing it again, of letting his gaze slide over each familiar mark, brought him a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from novelty, but from the deep comfort of knowing exactly where you are and exactly how the space will respond to you. He reached the junction where the corridor opened into a wider section, and as he approached, the lights in that area brightened by a fraction, as though sensing his arrival just a breath too late, creating the gentlest lag between his movement and the room's response. The result was a soft, almost theatrical unfolding of brightness that never fully sharpened, and Cole liked that about this place, the way it never rushed to reveal itself, the way it seemed to prefer gradualness over sudden clarity. Sometimes he wondered if that was why the work here suited him so well, why he felt less like an employee and more like a small, steady part of the building's own long exhale. At the center of the widened space sat the check-in desk, a low island of wood and metal with a surface that had been worn smooth by years of clipboards, elbows, notebooks, and the occasional resting head. Cole approached it without hurry, set his thermos down with a gentle, hollowed thud that echoed just enough to register, and then faded neatly back into the room's underlying hush. That sound had become one of his favorite anchors, the specific note of metal meeting wood in this exact space at this exact time of night, and as soon as it dissolved into silence, he felt the night settle around him with a kind of acceptance, like an old habit slipping easily back into place. He slid a hand along the edge of the desk, feeling the faint indentations where rings or pens or keys had left their almost invisible signatures over the years, and for a moment he thought of the keepers who had stood here before him, each beginning their shift in their own way, each bringing their own thoughts and worries and tiredness to this exact point before letting it all dissolve into the work. The building had held all of it, he imagined. The quiet impatience, the private relief, the stories that never made it into any logbook, and yet tonight, like every night, it presented itself to him with the same steady, unbothered calm, asking nothing more than that he move slowly and pay attention. He reached for the thermos, twisting the lid with a soft, measured motion that produced a low, rounded scrape of metal turning against metal, and as the seal loosened, a thin spiral of steam escaped, curling upward in a lazy, deliberate ribbon that caught the ambient light just enough to be seen. Cole watched the steam rise, the way it drifted and thinned and eventually vanished into the air, and his mind, without being asked, gently brushed against that quiet question again, the one that followed him into every room of this place, the one that never sharpened into words unless he let it. After the burn, what remains? The steam was a simple thing, a byproduct of warmed liquid meeting cooler air, but in that slow dissolving motion, He could feel the echo of the work he did here, the way heat transformed, the way it encouraged things to let go of their shape and become something else, something less heavy, something that clung not to the ground, but to the air itself. He poured a small amount of coffee into the lid, the dark liquid forming a smooth, still pool that held the reflection of the overhead light in a soft, shimmering oval. He didn't drink much coffee during his shifts, not because he didn't like it, but because he had long ago realized that staying awake here had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with attentiveness, with the gentle discipline of noticing. Still, he liked the ritual of it, the warmth in his hand, the faint bitter aroma rising into the air, the way the first sip always felt like a quiet handshake with the night. He lifted the lid to his lips and took a slow sip, letting the warmth move over his tongue and down his throat in a single, unhurried line. And he felt his chest accept the heat and then release it back into the room in the form of another long, steady breath. He set the lid down again, just off-center, so that it made a soft, rounded tap against the desk, then slid the thermos slightly aside, clearing a small space in front of him where a clipboard and pen waited. The sign-in sheet was almost unnecessary. No one else was here to read it, and the system logs would track his presence anyway. But he filled it out each night with careful handwriting, recording the date, the time, his name, and a brief note in the margin that only he ever saw. Sometimes it was a word like quiet or rain-heavy or crisp, a small tag for the texture of the night. Sometimes it was nothing more than a short, curved line that meant everything felt as expected. Tonight, he wrote, soft hum, calm air. The pen moved across the paper in strokes that matched his breathing, long, even, unbroken. And when he finished, he set it down parallel to the clipboard, aligning it by instinct. He let his gaze linger on the words for a moment, then gently turned the page back so the top sheet lay clean again for the next entry, whenever that might be. Once, years ago, he had found an older keeper's note scribbled faintly at the bottom of a page, just a single line, almost erased by time and eraser dust. It's easier when you think of it as returning, not ending. Cole hadn't known who wrote it or what night had prompted the thought, but the sentence had followed him ever since, drifting up from memory at odd moments, especially when he stood in front of the chamber or watched the gauges climb. He didn't know whether he fully agreed, but he understood the intention behind it, the gentle reframing, the desire to see the burn not as a taking, but as a letting go. He picked up his thermos again, screwed the lid back on with that same low circular sound, and cradled it loosely in one hand as he stepped away from the desk. The corridor ahead narrowed again, leading deeper toward the operational parts of the facility, and the lights adjusted subtly as he moved, their brightness shifting just enough to keep the space visible without ever becoming harsh. The air grew a fraction warmer the further he went, not enough to be obvious, but enough that he could feel a soft change along his forearms where his jacket left a slight gap, a hint of the dormant systems that lay waiting further inside. As he walked, he let his free hand hover near the wall, fingers not quite touching but close enough to feel the coolness radiating from the painted surface, and the simple act of pacing the corridor in this slow, attentive way settled him even more. This was the part of the shift he rarely talked about, the way the building itself seemed to participate, to offer him a sequence of small, quiet sensations that helped strip away the last remnants of the outside world. Out there, everything was linear and loud, full of to-do lists and interruptions, of abrupt noises and sharp edges. In here, the night unfolded in loops and soft gradients, guided by routines that never rushed him and never demanded more than his quiet presence. He passed a narrow window on his left, this one looking into a storage room where neatly stacked boxes rested in orderly rows, their labels facing outward with almost ceremonial precision. Nobody checked those boxes at night, but knowing they were there, stable and unchanged, added another layer to the calm. The world behind those doors did not need anything from him, just as the world outside no longer did. For the hours of his shift, his life had narrowed to these hallways, these rooms, these carefully tended spaces. And although some people might have found that limiting, he found it freeing, like walking into a smaller, quieter version of reality, where everything moved at the pace of his own breath. At the next corner, the corridor bent gently to the right, and as he followed the turn, the faint underlying hum in the floor shifted pitch again, almost imperceptibly. It was still the same dormant system, the same resting machinery, but to Cole, the change in tone felt like the building adjusting its posture, straightening a little, acknowledging that he was moving closer to the center of the work. It occurred to him, as it often did, that newcomers never noticed these subtleties. They saw a plain hallway, heard a generic background noise, smelled a mix of metal and cleanser, and nothing more. But for him, every inch of this place had acquired personality. Every sound, a history. Every scent, a layer. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the building thought of him in the same way, if such a thing were possible, remembering his footsteps, his pauses, the particular way his hands brushed the walls or rested on the table, the way he exhaled before turning on the chamber, the way he never rushed through the preparatory motions. The thought made him smile, not because he actually believed the structure was alive, but because thinking of it that way made the nights feel less solitary, as if he were part of an old conversation rather than a man alone in a concrete and metal shell. As he approached the door that led into the deeper wing, where the preparation room, the control space, and eventually the chamber itself waited, he felt that familiar sense of narrowing, of focus, like the world softly folding inward until only the essential remained. The corridor here grew a bit dimmer, not from neglect but by design. The lighting intentionally softened to give this transition space a sense of quiet threshold, as if crossing it meant stepping out of one kind of time and into another, slower one. Cole paused just before the door, letting his fingers rest on the handle without turning it, and closed his eyes for a breath. In that breath, the question came again, not as words, but as a soft, internal echo. After the burn, what remains? This time, he let the thought rest fully in his mind for a moment, allowed himself to feel the shape of it rather than push it aside, and with his eyes still closed, he exhaled, letting the air leave him slowly, as if he were handing the question back to the quiet, trusting it to hold it for him until later. He did not need to answer now. The night was long. The work would unfold at its own measured pace. Whatever remained of the day, of the vessel, of the warmth, would reveal itself in its own unhurried way. He opened his eyes, turned the handle with a controlled, almost reverent motion, and stepped through the doorway into the deeper quiet that waited beyond. Cole stepped deeper into the next hallway and felt the shift almost immediately, a subtle tightening of the ambient quiet that wasn't constricting but focused, as though the air here had been trained over many years to hold itself in a slightly denser stillness, like a held breath waiting for a soft signal. The temperature dipped only a fraction, just enough to make the hairs on his forearms notice, and the lighting dimmed into a deeper amber, not from lack of power, but from intention. The bulbs here humming at a lower, steadier frequency that seemed designed to slow the body down, guiding each inhale into a longer shape and each exhale into a softer release. Cole let that shift wash over him, allowed himself to lean into it, because this was where he always found the beginning of the night's core rhythm, the part of the facility that asked him to let go of whatever remnants of daylight still clung to him. He paused in front of the supply alcove, a recessed pocket in the wall that held neatly arranged items inside a glass front cabinet, disposable gloves in their stacked boxes, narrow bristle brushes with wooden handles, folded cloths tied in loose bundles of twine, and 3 small vials of citrus-scented solution whose labels had faded long ago, but whose use remained unmistakable. The cabinet light flicked on the moment his shadow crossed its sensor, illuminating everything inside with a low golden glow, and Cole reached for the small box of gloves, running his thumb across the cardboard edge in a slow sweep. He didn't open it yet. There was a sequence to things, and he liked keeping that sequence intact. But touching the box was part of the transition, a cue to his hands that the work ahead required precision, patience, and a kind of gentle steadiness that the world outside rarely rewarded. He stepped past the alcove and continued down the hall until he reached the slight incline that led toward the inner wing. The incline so subtle most people wouldn't notice it, but Cole always did. It was another one of those small architectural decisions that guided movement without declaring itself, nudging footsteps into a slower descent, nudging breath into a longer rhythm. He descended with the same unbroken pace, and as he did, the underlying hum beneath the floor shifted once more, deepening into a rounder vibration that resonated faintly in the soles of his boots. It was not the active chamber, just the idle systems cycling quietly, distributing warmth in low intervals to keep the machinery from cooling too drastically between shifts. But Cole could tell the difference between the hum of idling heat and the hum of work, the difference between a chamber that waited and a chamber that had begun its slow transformation. He reached the bottom of the incline and stood for a moment at the center of a 3-way junction, the lights angled in a way that created soft, overlapping shadows across the walls. almost like drifting silhouettes that moved with the faint fluctuations of the bulbs. This was the point where the building always felt most like a living thing to him, not because it made any sound beyond the ambient machinery, but because the shape of the hallways here converged in a way that created a pocket of echo, a space where even the smallest sound, his breath, his step, the faint shift of fabric, felt slightly amplified, as if the building were listening with a gentle attentiveness. Cole had never mentioned this sensation to anyone, and he didn't need to. It was one of those quiet gifts the structure offered him each night, an invitation to continue deeper into the familiar quiet, without questioning why the place felt so receptive. He took another slow sip from his thermos, letting the warmth gather behind his lungs before spreading through his chest in a subtle bloom. And then he began moving toward the door at the far left of the junction, the one that led toward the preparation room, the control station, and eventually the chamber itself. The hallway here narrowed again, the ceiling dipping by an inch or two, creating a softer, more intimate atmosphere, and Cole always found himself lowering his shoulders just slightly as he walked this stretch, not out of tension, but out of alignment, as if matching the shape of the space helped him ease into the deeper pace the night demanded. Halfway down the hallway, he passed a small wall vent, and a faint current of warmer air brushed across his wrist, carrying with it the scent of heated metal and something that resembled old dust baked into stone, an aroma so specific to this place that Cole could have identified it blindfolded. The warmth reminded him again of the transformation at the heart of his work, the slow, steady process that would come later in the night. And for a moment, the question drifted back into him, softer than before, almost affectionate. After the burn, what remains? The question didn't urge him toward an answer. It simply kept him company, a gentle presence he had long since made peace with. He rounded the final corner leading into the preparation wing, and as he approached, the lighting adjusted once more, brightening a fraction so that the edges of the door ahead glowed faintly, creating a halo of warm amber that framed the entrance like a quiet welcome. Cole slowed his steps, not because he needed to, but because this moment, the threshold before entering the next stage of the night, required a certain softness, a certain respect for the ritual that held the work together. He reached the door, placed his hand flat against it for a heartbeat, feeling the temperature of the metal, the slight vibration of the systems humming behind it. And then he exhaled, letting the last remnants of the outside world slip away. The door responded with a gentle give beneath his palm, opening into the deeper quiet that waited inside, a quiet he knew as intimately as his own breath. He stepped through, letting the door ease shut behind him, and the familiar warmth of the preparation wing wrapped around him like a slow, steady tide. Cole stepped into the preparation room with the same slow certainty he always carried into this space, and the moment the door settled shut behind him, he felt the air change again, thickening by the smallest degree, not in weight, but in presence, as if the room itself had shifted its attention toward him. The overhead lights hummed at their usual low frequency, a soft amber glow spreading in wide, gentle bands across the counters and the neatly arranged shelves, the shadows softening into long velvety shapes that clung to the corners without ever fully darkening them. This room had a way of tempering everything that entered it, smoothing edges, slowing breath, and drawing even the most restless mind into its unhurried rhythm, and Cole felt himself slipping instinctively into that cadence, as if some deep part of him recognized this room as a kind of silent teacher. He moved through the space without rush, eyes gliding over the familiar arrangement of tools and surfaces that had become as known to him as the lines of his palms. The long counter on the left, with its faintly scuffed metal surface, the cabinets beneath it labeled in quiet handwriting, cloths, straps, spare brushes, and above them the shelves that held a curated set of items arranged with almost ceremonial precision. On the uppermost shelf, 3 wide brushes sat in a row, one with stiff bristles for sweeping dust, one slightly softer for delicate surfaces, and one nearly feather-light for the final pass. Beneath them lay a row of metal bowls, each identical except for the tiny engraved mark on its underside, an old numbering system that no one used anymore, but that Cole honored by keeping the bowls in their proper order. He walked closer and let his fingers hover just above the bowls, feeling the faint temperature difference radiating from the metal. And in that subtle warmth, he sensed the quiet history of every hand that had lifted them before him. The bowls weren't special in any practical sense. They were tools, simple and functional. But the years had lent them a kind of quiet dignity, the sort of importance that grew not from rarity, but from repetition. Cole slid his hand along the edge of the shelf, grazing the smooth wood with the back of his knuckles, and felt the slight dip where the grain had been worn down over time, a sign of countless keepers brushing past. Tidying, checking, arranging. This room did not change quickly. It changed slowly, subtly, on the scale of seasons rather than days, and something about that slowness comforted him deeply. He turned his attention to the central table, a wide metal surface that had been polished so many times that its finish held a soft, clouded sheen rather than a bright reflection, a surface that invited slow work and discouraged haste. Cole placed his gloves on one corner of the table, aligning them with a quiet precision that came from years of habit rather than conscious thought, and then he rested both palms lightly on the cool metal, feeling the faint residual chill seep into his skin. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the room's temperature, its hum, its quiet weight settle into him, and he exhaled in a long, unbroken stream that seemed to draw the last remnants of noise from his mind. When he opened his eyes, his gaze drifted toward the set of drawers beneath the table. Each drawer held a different category of tools: cotton ties, soft linen cloths, unused straps rolled into tidy spirals, sealed packets of absorbent pads, and a collection of tiny instruments whose purpose was more symbolic than functional. Now, relics of older procedures that had been phased out but never fully discarded. Cole pulled open the second drawer, the one containing the cloths, and was greeted by the familiar sight of neatly folded squares, arranged in stacks that rose evenly from the drawer base. The cloths varied slightly in shade, some a muted ivory, others a pale gray that looked almost silver under the amber light. But all of them carried the same soft texture, the kind of weave that had just enough weight to settle smoothly when placed, but remained gentle enough not to disturb delicate surfaces. He lifted one cloth from the top of the nearest stack, unfolding it slowly so it draped across both hands like a thin sheet of warmth. The fabric caught the light in subtle ripples, revealing the tiny crosshatch pattern that only became visible when stretched at certain angles. And Cole let his eyes trace those intersecting threads, appreciating the simple craftsmanship that went unnoticed by most people. He folded the cloth again, smoothing the edges between his fingers, then set it aside on the table with a long, quiet motion that seemed to merge with the room's own rhythm. Next, he reached for the brush rack, where the 3 brushes rested like instruments waiting for a conductor's hand. He lifted the middle brush, the soft one, and held it up to the light, turning it slowly so the bristles caught the glow and revealed tiny variations in shade, from deep umber at the base to a lighter, almost golden brown at the tips. The brush had been used thousands of times, its handle worn to a faint matte finish where his fingers naturally gripped it, yet it remained as dependable as ever, its bristles fanning out with the same gentle resilience night after night. Cole ran the pad of his thumb lightly across the edge of the bristles, feeling their give, and allowed himself a brief memory of the first time he had used it, how tentative he had felt, how reverent, how aware he was of the long lineage of hands that had handled it before him. That reverence had never left him. If anything, it had deepened. He set the brush back into the rack with the same careful precision, aligning it with its neighbors so their handles formed a straight, unbroken line, and then he moved to the sink at the far end of the room. The faucet here was older than the one in the outer hallway, its handles slightly stiff from age but still smooth in motion, and when Cole turned it, water flowed out in a narrow, controlled stream that released a warm, steady hiss into the quiet. The room filled with the faint scent of heated minerals, a scent that clung to the edges of the steam curling upward, and Cole watched the rising wisps with the same attentive calm he gave to all small movements in this place. He cupped his hands beneath the stream, feeling the warmth pool between his palms before sliding away. And for a moment, the sensation reminded him of something he had never put into words, a sense that warmth, water, and patience were all part of the same gentle vocabulary the room used to teach him how to move. He turned off the faucet, letting the last drops fall into the basin with soft, rhythmic taps, and reached for one of the metal bowls. As he lifted it, the bowl released a faint ring, a quiet resonance that traveled along the surface and then dissolved almost immediately into the ambient hush. Cole filled the bowl halfway with warm water, carrying it back to the table with careful steps, ensuring the surface of the water remained smooth and undisturbed. When he set the bowl down, he watched the light ripple across its surface, the amber glow shifting in soft waves, and he felt something inside him settle more deeply than before, as if each tiny wave whispered a reminder that nothing in this room moved fast and nothing needed to. He reached for a folded cloth and dipped one corner into the bowl, watching as the fabric darkened, absorbing the warmth in a gradual gradient. The cloth grew heavy at one end, and he lifted it with both hands, pressing the warm portion between his palms as he exhaled again, letting the heat seep into his skin. Warmth in this room always felt older than the heat of the chamber, gentler, quieter, a warmth made for preparation rather than transformation, and he let it linger there, soaking slowly upward through his fingers. Then, with the cloth warm in his hands, he began wiping the surface of the table in long, continuous arcs, following an invisible pattern he had long ago memorized. Each stroke was slow, steady, and deliberate, the damp cloth leaving behind a faint sheen that would evaporate within moments, but the movement itself carried meaning. It signaled the beginning of readiness, the shift from arrival to presence, from presence to purpose. And as he continued the slow ritual of wiping, folding, smoothing, and wiping again, the question drifted through his thoughts once more, not intrusive, not insistent, but familiar. After the burn, what remains? The room seemed to hold the question with him, not answering, not urging, simply acknowledging it as part of the night, part of the rhythm, part of the quiet bond between him and the work. The cloth grew cooler in his hands, and when the warmth faded entirely, he rinsed it again, folded it in half twice, and placed it neatly atop the first cloth he had set aside. Then he stepped back from the table, letting his shoulders relax, letting his breath lengthen, letting the room draw him into its patient calm. Cole stood for another long moment at the center of the preparation room, letting the faint warmth of the metal bowls drift into the air and settle against his skin in soft, nearly imperceptible waves. And as he breathed, he became aware again of the room's quiet pulse, the subtle thrum of machinery beneath the floor, the distant click of temperature regulators adjusting in slow intervals, the faint whisper of the ventilation system weaving its way along the ceiling like a drifting thread of air. None of these sounds were loud enough to draw attention on their own, but together they formed the room's steady heartbeat, a patient rhythm that had accompanied every night of his work for as long as he could remember, calming him in ways he could never quite explain. He moved toward the storage cabinet on the far wall, the one with the slightly uneven hinge that caused the door to open with a tiny, softened resistance, and he brushed his fingertips along the edge before pulling it open. Inside, neatly arranged in wide metal trays, were the straps, cotton bands of varying lengths, each rolled into tight spirals like sleeping creatures. The bands were pale, almost ivory, their fibers woven with a texture meant to be strong yet gentle, and the light from above washed across them in a warm, golden gradient. Cole selected one of the shorter straps and held it up, letting it unroll slightly between his fingers, the fabric sliding with a whisper-soft friction that he found inexplicably soothing. He examined it with the same attentive calm he gave every object in this room, turning it slowly to observe the faint seams stitched along its edges, seams that had held through years of repeated use without fraying. After returning the strap to its tray, he closed the cabinet door with a quiet thud and crossed the room toward the small wooden stool near the corner. The stool had been here longer than he had, longer than any keeper he knew, and its legs carried faint scratches from decades of being moved across the floor. Cole set his hand on its worn surface, noticing the smoothness left behind by countless fingers that had touched the same place, and then he gently nudged it aside to create more space near the wall. This was part of the room's ritual too, though no manual mentioned it. Shifting the stool made room for movement, helped the air settle, allowed Cole to create a clear path between the table and the storage cabinets. And though he could have done the job without moving anything, the act of adjusting the space felt necessary, like straightening a blanket before lying down. He took a slow step back, letting his eyes sweep the room from corner to corner in a single, unbroken arc, absorbing the details that might go unnoticed by someone else, but that formed the essence of his nightly routine. The gentle bowing of the overhead light as it leaned into its own warmth, the subtle shift in texture where the tile floor met the base of the wall, the faint scatter of dust motes suspended in the amber glow, drifting lazily as if the room itself had lulled them into a slower version of drifting. Cole lifted a hand and passed it through the air just above the table, not touching anything, simply feeling the slight movement of temperature that always hovered above the warmed cloths and metal surfaces, and he sensed the room responding in its own patient way, the quiet thickening or softening around him in tiny gradients he had learned to interpret intuitively. He returned to the table and picked up the middle brush again, the soft bristled one that carried hints of long use in the way its bristles fanned slightly wider than the others, and he held it by the handle with a steady, practiced grip. He moved the brush in slow, measured strokes across the metal surface, back and forth, then in gentle arcs, then in long, sweeping lines that seemed to erase tension from the air itself. Each movement left behind a faint trail of shifting reflection, like currents of dim light sliding across a shallow tide, and Cole followed those patterns with his eyes, letting them lull him deeper into the room's quiet logic. This part of the work was never rushed. If anything, he stretched it out intentionally, knowing the room seemed to prefer this slower pace, as though offering patience created a type of connection between his hands and the space around him. When he finally set the brush down, aligning it precisely with the others in the rack, he noticed the faint warmth gathering along his forearms, a comfort created not by temperature, but by repetition, the muscle-deep familiarity of doing something in the exact same way every night. He reached for another cloth, unfolded it with care, and laid it flat across the table, smoothing the edges with both palms, pressing gently until the fabric settled into the metal like water finding its level. The stroke of his hands across the cloth released a mild scent of cotton and heat, a combination that reminded him of summer laundry left too long in the sun, and he let that scent linger in his senses before folding the cloth again and placing it neatly beside the others. He moved next to the small scale in the corner, an older model with a circular dial, its needle resting at 0 in the calm, expectant way of tools that had been used for years without complaint. Cole placed his hand on its cool surface, feeling the way the metal resisted slightly before warming under his touch. And then, for no reason other than ritual, he lifted it briefly off the counter and set it back down again, listening to the soft click of its rubber feet settling into place. The movement had no practical purpose at this moment, but it grounded him in the repetition of the night, reminding him that each object in this room had a weight, a presence, a role in the slow choreography they performed together. The air shifted again, barely, gently, as the ventilation system cycled once more, carrying a thin thread of warmth across the back of his neck. Cole let his eyes close for a heartbeat, letting that warmth pass through him like a soft tide rolling in. And when he opened them, the question appeared again at the edge of his awareness, whisper light but unmistakable. After the burn, what remains? The room didn't answer, but it held the question with him, as if acknowledging it was part of its own long memory too. Something generations of keepers had carried, pondered, and allowed to drift into the quiet without needing resolution. He took another slow step back from the table, inhaling deeply, letting the scent of warm water and brushed metal fill his lungs, and he felt the entire room settle into an equilibrium, a kind of internal balance that signaled the readiness of both space and mind. Everything was clean, aligned, smoothed, softened. Everything had been touched with care, with intention, with patience. The room felt full, not cluttered, not busy, but full of a gentle energy that awaited the next stage of the night, the stage that would unfold just beyond this space. Cole brushed a faint trace of dust from his sleeve, a reflex more than a necessity, and reached for his gloves, lifting them with a deliberate slowness that matched the room's own calm. The gloves were warm now from sitting beneath the amber light, their material soft and pliant under his fingers, and he held them loosely for a breath, feeling the weight of the night settle into place around him like a familiar cloak. When he finally slipped his fingers into the gloves and felt the snug embrace of the material, he knew the room's lesson had been given again: patience, repetition, gentleness, and he knew his body and mind had shifted fully into the cadence of the work. The preparation room, with all its small rituals and quiet expectations, had taught its lesson for the night, and Cole accepted it without a word, letting the calm sink deep into his bones. He turned toward the door that led to the inner wing, the faint hum of machinery waiting no longer as a distant echo, but as a nearby presence, and he reached for the handle, pausing just long enough to breathe once more in the warm, patient air of the room that always slowed him, always shaped him, always readied him for whatever came next. Then, with a gentle push, he stepped out of the room and into the deeper quiet that waited beyond. The door eased shut behind Cole with a gentle click, sealing him into the preparation wing where the air felt warmer than the corridor outside, carrying with it a softness that seemed to settle immediately into the folds of his sleeves and the spaces between his fingers. And he paused just inside the threshold, letting that warmth spread slowly across his skin, letting it coax his breathing into an even quieter rhythm. The light in this room was slightly different from the others, still amber, still soft, but deeper in tone, almost honey-like, filling the surfaces with a glow that looked less like illumination and more like the lingering memory of sunlight, the remnants of heat from a day that had long since passed. Cole stepped forward, his boots making almost no sound against the smooth floor, and he felt the space shift subtly around him, as if acknowledging his presence, as if reshaping its quiet to wrap more closely around his movements. He approached the sink first, the one fitted with the older faucet, whose curved neck and slightly tarnished edges always reminded him of something antique, something that had belonged to other hands long before his own. The handle resisted him gently as he turned it, releasing a muted creak, and then the stream of warm water fell into the basin in a thin, steady ribbon that made a sound like fabric being smoothed over stone, soft, continuous, without beginning or end. Steam rose in slow spirals, drifting upward in lazy curls that blended into the ambient glow, and Cole leaned closer, feeling the warmth kiss his face with the faintest dampness. He cupped his hands beneath the stream, letting the water pool and spill over in a small cascade that carried its own delicate rhythm, a hush layered beneath a hush, and as the warmth seeped into the spaces between his fingers, he felt something inside him loosen further, as if the night itself had guided him into this exact moment for the sake of reminding him how gentle warmth could be when given room to unfold. He lifted his hand slightly, watching the water drip in slow, elongated beads that stretched before falling back into the basin, each drop making a soft, hollow sound that echoed faintly against the metal. Cole reached for one of the folded cloths on the nearby tray, a square of soft, tightly woven linen whose edges curled slightly inward from repeated washing, and dipped a corner into the stream, watching the fibers darken and absorb the heat. He lowered the rest of the cloth into the water slowly, letting it sink, letting it fill, letting the warmth travel through it until the entire piece felt heavy with softness. When he lifted it out, the water clung to the fabric in a smooth sheet before dripping rhythmically from its corner, and he twisted it lightly between his hands, not enough to wring it dry, but enough to guide the excess into a thin trail that circled the sink in careful spirals. He held the cloth for a breath, feeling its weight, its pliability, its quiet heat, and then moved toward the long metal table in the center of the room. The table's surface was cool even under the amber glow, and when Cole pressed the warm cloth against it, the contrast created a faint puff of steam that drifted upward like the sigh of something old, stirring beneath a blanket. He began wiping the surface in long, fluid strokes, each one overlapping the last with slow precision, and the warmth left behind a brief fog that faded almost as soon as it appeared, dissolving into the room's patient air. The cloth moved with a gentle drag across the metal, producing a sound that was barely more than a whisper, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic, like distant waves brushing against a shore of polished stone. Cole followed the lines of the table from one end to the other, pausing occasionally to dip the cloth back into the warm water, refreshing its heat before returning to the surface. Each time he pressed the cloth down, the warmth spread under his palm in a faint pulse, easing into the metal, and he imagined, not for the first time, that the table absorbed the warmth the way a body might absorb comfort, the way a memory might absorb meaning. He reached the far edge of the table and folded the cloth over itself, smoothing the crease with the back of his hand before lifting it in a slow arc that released a few last droplets onto the metal. As he did, he noticed the faint shimmer of water forming thin, branching lines, tiny veins of brightness that traced across the surface for a moment before fading into invisibility, as if the table itself were breathing the warmth in. Cole found himself lingering on that sight, letting his eyes soften as he followed the drifting patterns, and the moment carried a quiet, intimate weight that grounded him deeper into the night. He returned to the basin and refreshed the cloth again, this time allowing it to fully submerge. Watching the rising bubbles collect along its edges before floating to the surface. When he lifted it again, the cloth glowed slightly under the room's light, its fibers saturated and pliant, and he folded it twice more before pressing it gently against his palm, savoring the warmth that radiated through the thin barrier of glove and skin. And somewhere inside the warmth, somewhere between the sound of water dripping and the haze of steam rising, the familiar question brushed softly through his thoughts, lighter than in the earlier hours of the shift, almost like a breeze catching the corner of a page. After the burn, what remains? Cole didn't answer, just as he never answered in this room. He simply let the question drift through him, letting it settle along the edges of his awareness in the same way he let warmth settle into the cloth, trusting it to find its own place in the quiet without demanding resolution. He moved along the room again, wiping surfaces, smoothing cloths, refreshing the warm water in slow, deliberate motions that, to anyone else, might have seemed excessive, but to him felt essential. A way of aligning the room with the work, a way of preparing not just the physical space, but the emotional silence that supported the night. And as he worked, the warmth continued to rise around him in soft waves, folding gently into the quiet, teaching him again and again that some tasks were not done for completion, but for the sake of the moment they created. Cole dipped the cloth back into the warm water again, letting it sink slowly until it lay completely beneath the surface, the fabric absorbing heat with a steady, unhurried pull that reminded him of breath being drawn through half-closed lips. And he watched the way tiny strands of steam curled upward from the water's surface, rising in fragile ribbons that drifted lazily toward the ceiling before dissolving into the amber haze. When he lifted the cloth, the warm weight of it rested in his hands like something alive, pliant and obedient to gravity. And as he twisted it gently, beads of water gathered along its edge and fell one by one into the metal basin, each droplet releasing a soft, hollow sound that echoed briefly before fading into the room's warm quiet. He pressed the cloth to his forearm for a moment, not for any practical reason, but because the warmth helped steady him, helped remind him of the gentle pace the night required, and the heat lingered through the thin layer of fabric and glove, seeping into his skin in a way that made the moment feel almost suspended, like a breath held for just a beat longer than necessary. When he finally lowered the cloth, he carried it to the far counter, where a series of small drawers lined the space beneath the surface like a row of sleeping animals. The handles were cool to the touch, each one carrying a slightly different texture from years of fingertips, brushing, tugging, pulling. And Cole opened the leftmost drawer with the same slow patience he gave every object in this room. Inside, neatly arranged in a single layer, were the smaller linens, thin, soft pieces used for precise work. Each square folded into a perfect quarter and stacked in pale towers that leaned ever so slightly toward the light. He picked one up, feeling its surprising lightness, the way it seemed almost too soft to hold its shape, and he placed it gently on the counter before laying the warm cloth over it, spreading them together so the warmth traveled across both layers. The two textiles, one heavier with absorbed heat, the other featherlight, formed a quiet contrast under his hands, and he smoothed them with long, deliberate motions that coaxed the fibers into relaxing. He took a slow step back and studied the countertop once more, letting his eyes drift across the surface in a careful sweep, and for a moment he imagined that each small object in the room, from the bowls to the brushes to the folded linens, was engaged in its own quiet ritual, waiting for him to complete this sequence of actions that had been carried out countless times before. The room felt older here, not in any physical way, but in atmosphere, as if the warmth had settled into the very structure over generations, seeping into the corners, the walls, the hinges, the small imperfections in the tile. It was the kind of age that brought comfort rather than decay, the kind that spoke of endurance and care, a patient presence that had witnessed countless nights much like this one. He crossed back toward the sink and turned the faucet slightly, adjusting the temperature until the steam thickened just enough to create a soft blur around the basin, and he dipped both hands under the stream again, letting the warmth spread across his palms and wrists. He rotated his hands slowly beneath the water, watching as the stream split around his fingers and rejoined beneath them in a seamless sheet. And in the quiet sound of the flowing water, he could almost hear the distant hum of the chamber waiting in the deeper wing, a hum that was not yet active but always present, always ready to unfold its own ritual when the time arrived. Cole closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the water pull him deeper inward, letting the sound blend with his breath until both became a single, steady rhythm. And somewhere in that rhythm, the familiar question drifted through his awareness again. Not sharp, not defined, more like a memory of a question than the question itself. After the burn, what remains? The words drifted without weight, without expectation, like steam rising from the cloth, like warmth fading into the table. And Cole let them linger, let them hover on the inside edges of his thoughts before dissolving back into the quiet. He shut off the faucet and wiped his hands along the soft towel hanging at the sink side, a towel whose fibers had been worn thin at the edges from years of being used in this exact way. And he returned to the central table, where the warm cloths rested in parallel lines. He lifted one, folded it into a slim rectangle, and dragged it gently along the metal's edge, smoothing the line where two panels of steel met, watching the thin sheen of moisture evaporate almost instantly into the warm air. The movement was slow, almost ceremonial, each pass a gentle reassurance that the space was ready, that the room had been calmed and tended to with the same patience it had taught him over the years. He returned the cloth to the table and let his fingers brush lightly along the surface, feeling the faint warmth that clung to the metal from the repeated passes. And he imagined how many times previous keepers had done this same motion, how many nights had been softened by the same slow sequences of water and linen and gentle strokes. The thought made him pause, letting that continuity settle into him like a soft reminder that he was part of something older and quieter than himself, a small link in a long chain of hands that had tended this room at the same pace, listened to the same hum, cleaned the same spaces without ever rushing. He stepped toward the corner where a narrow vertical cabinet held a row of glass jars, each one filled with something simple: cotton tufts, folded squares of gauze, lengths of soft twine, and he opened the cabinet slowly, letting the tiny latch click open in a sound so delicate it barely registered. The glass jars reflected the warm light in soft halos, and Cole lifted one from the middle shelf, turning it in his hands until the cork stopper caught the glow. Inside, the cotton tufts floated like small clouds, compressed gently against one another, and the sight of them, poised and quiet, always gave him the sense that time moved more slowly in this room. He replaced the jar and closed the cabinet, letting the latch settle with almost no sound, and he walked once more to the warm cloths, giving the room a final sweep with his eyes, checking each surface, each tool, each small arrangement, until everything felt aligned. The air around him carried a soft humidity now, a warmth that clung faintly to his sleeves, to his gloves, to the edges of his collar, and he breathed it in, letting it settle inside his lungs with the same kind of slow ease that defined every moment he spent here. Cole gathered the cloths, folding them into precise shapes and stacking them at the far edge of the table in a neat, measured pile, and he rested his fingertips on the top cloth for a lingering second, feeling the warmth bleed gradually upward into his glove. Then he straightened, letting his breath fall into a long, steady exhale, and he felt the room quiet even further, as if both he and the space had reached the end of this ritual's arc. The warmth, the water, the soft weight of fabric, each had played its part in drawing him deeper into the night's quiet, into the slow unfolding of the work ahead. The preparation was done. The room was ready, and so was he. With one last glance at the table, Cole moved toward the door at the far end of the room, the doorway that would lead him closer to the chamber, and he pressed his palm against the cool metal of the handle, letting the warmth from his earlier work contrast with the chill beneath his glove. Then, with a gentle push, he stepped forward into the deeper silence, waiting beyond. Cole stepped from the warmth of the preparation room into the narrower hallway that led toward the chamber, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate but gentle, like moving from a room warmed by human hands into a space warmed by something older, slower, and far more patient. The walls here held a denser quiet, not oppressive, but thick with the kind of silence that settled into stone over decades. And as he walked, his footsteps softened even more, absorbed by the faintly textured floor that gave under his weight with the muted sigh of worn material. The amber lights above him dimmed to a deeper shade, casting the corridor in a bronze glow that made every surface look slightly burnished, as though touched repeatedly by warm air drifting through unseen vents. He let his hand trail along the wall as he moved, feeling the gradual shift in temperature beneath the surface, cool at first, then warmer, then faintly warm, then warm once more, as if the structure itself breathed in slow, steady cycles, exhaling heat from its deeper heart. The closer he moved to the chamber, the more noticeable the warmth became, not in a way that made him sweat or retreat, but in a way that settled into his bones, like the ebb of a distant hearth. Every keeper who had ever worked here knew this warmth, the quiet signature of the chamber's long memory, and Cole had grown to recognize its nuances the way a musician recognizes the subtle changes in a familiar instrument. At the end of the hallway, the chamber door waited, tall, solid, a muted rectangle of darkened steel framed by fire brick that had been laid long before Cole arrived and would remain long after he was gone. The bricks held a color that the amber light couldn't fully reveal, a deep reddish tone that seemed to glow from within rather than reflect anything from without. And as Cole drew near, he felt that quiet hum that always emanated from behind the door, a hum so low it hovered at the threshold of perception, more vibration than sound, more presence than noise. He placed his palm against the door, not to open it yet, but to acknowledge it, to feel the residual warmth clinging to the metal. The heat was faint but unmistakable, the kind of warmth that suggested something living on the other side, not alive in any dangerous way, but alive in the sense of continual motion, continual patience. A machine that never truly slept, even when its flames were dormant. Cole held his hand there long enough for his glove to absorb a trace of that warmth, long enough for his breath to align with the soft vibration under his palm, and only then did he turn the handle. The door opened with a slow, weighted motion, releasing a warm exhale of air into the corridor, a draft that curled around his face and collar like the breath of a quiet giant stirring from slumber. The temperature inside the chamber room was higher than the hallway, but not unpleasant, more like stepping into a greenhouse at dusk, where heat had gathered throughout the day and now drifted outward in soft, gentle tides. Cole stepped inside, letting the door settle behind him with a muted thud, and stood still as the space adjusted around him, as if acknowledging his arrival, the way an old friend adjusts their posture when someone familiar enters the room. The chamber room was larger than most people expected, though few ever saw it. The walls were lined with fire brick, each brick etched with faint marks from years of exposure to heat, and though no flames were active now, the room held the memory of them, radiating a stored warmth that seeped into the air in slow, steady waves. Overhead, long ventilation ducts stretched like quiet ribs, humming faintly, their steady exhale creating the gentlest breeze that brushed against Cole's jaw and drifted through his hair. He inhaled deeply, letting the warm, mineral-rich scent fill his lungs, the scent of heated stone, resting metal, and a kind of clean dryness that only places steeped in heat could carry. He took a few slow steps toward the center of the room, where the chamber itself waited, not imposing, not threatening, but steady and grounded, as if it had grown out of the floor rather than been built into it. The structure was rectangular, made of darkened steel, softened by years of warmth, and even in stillness it seemed to vibrate faintly with the echo of all the nights it had endured, all the transformations it had overseen. Cole approached it with the same quiet reverence he carried every night, placing his hand once more on its edge, feeling the faintest tremor beneath the surface, a tremor that wasn't motion, but memory, the lingering hum of something that had worked for longer than any single human lifetime. The chamber did not glow, did not roar, did not intimidate. Instead, it rested like an ancient animal at peace. Its heat low and steady, its presence wide and calm. Cole always thought of it as listening, not actively, not consciously, but in the way old trees listen, in the way rivers listen, in the way structures that have endured for decades hold the quiet intentions of those who tend them. He felt that listening now, a subtle awareness that asked nothing of him, and yet acknowledged every movement he made, every breath he took, every slow step he walked around its perimeter. He ran his fingers along the seam where the chamber door met the frame, feeling the slight ridge that marked the line between inside and outside, between stillness and transformation. And he let his breath escape in a long, quiet stream as his mind brushed lightly against the question that had followed him all night. After the burn, what remains? Here, in this room, the question always felt different, less like a puzzle and more like a truth he didn't need to fully understand. A truth that lived in the walls, the warmth, the long-standing structure of the chamber itself. He stepped to the control panel on the side wall, its surface smooth and slightly warm beneath the amber light, its gauges and dials resting in positions that felt almost like a sleeping heartbeat. Cole didn't touch anything yet. He simply stood there, letting the soft hum weave around him, letting the warm air drift across his shoulders, letting the whole room settle into its familiar balance. And in that stillness, he felt something he always felt here, the quiet impression that the room, the brick, the metal, and the air all remembered him, remembered every night he had stood in this exact place, performing the same gentle rituals, entering with the same calm presence. The chamber room did not need him to hurry. It never did. It simply waited, patient and warm, like a vast, slow-breathing thing made not of flesh or bone, but of fire and stone and memory. And Cole, standing there with his gloves warm, his breath steady, and his thoughts drifting in long, soft arcs, felt himself ready to move into the next part of the night. Cole stood beside the control panel for another long moment, letting his eyes follow the slow rise and fall of the small indicator lights along its surface, each one pulsing with the faintest glow, like distant lanterns drifting in a fog. He reached toward one of the dials, not to adjust it yet, simply to rest his fingertips near it, and felt the warmth radiating from the metal in a steady wave. The kind of warmth that suggested countless nights of use, countless hours of heat, passing through the chamber in cycles so patient and measured they felt almost like seasons turning in miniature. The panel did not demand attention. It waited, unhurried, as though aware that Cole needed to become fully aligned with the room before beginning the delicate sequence that governed the chamber's waking rhythm. He walked around the chamber's edge, moving slowly along the fire brick wall where faint lines and variations in color told the history of heat pressing against stone, heat rising through channels, heat settling into the foundation. The bricks closest to the chamber were darker, marked by years of radiant warmth, but even these marks were soft, more like blushes of color than scars. As though the fire had always burned with an understanding of its own place, never violent, never excessive, always measured under the watch of those who tended it. Cole let his gloved fingers brush the bricks lightly, feeling the residual heat seep into his fingertips, and he imagined how many hands before his had traced these same lines. How many keepers had paused at this exact spot, feeling the quiet endurance of fire brick that had witnessed transformation night after night. He stepped closer to the chamber door, placing his hand against the broad metal surface once more. The warmth here was different from the warmth in the room, denser, quieter, like the heat at the core of a large animal resting in deep slumber. This warmth had layers, the surface warmth, the deeper warmth beneath that, and beneath even that, the heat of the chamber's memory, the kind that only metal could hold after years of carrying the flame. Cole leaned forward slightly and let his forehead hover just an inch from the metal, not touching it, but close enough to feel the faintest radiance drifting into the space between them. For a moment, he closed his eyes, breathing in slowly through his nose, letting that warmth gather behind his eyelids before releasing it in a long exhale. And in that quiet breath, something subtle happened. The room seemed to settle around him, the hum aligning with his pulse, the ventilation shifting in a barely audible sweep of air, the chamber's low tremor deepening by a shade so faint most people would never detect it. But Cole did. He always did. This was the moment when the chamber acknowledged him, not as a keeper, not as a worker, but as a presence it recognized, a presence it had grown accustomed to over years of shared nights. He opened his eyes and stepped back, letting the distance reestablish itself slowly. Then he turned toward the rolling table positioned near the far wall, a table fitted with thick caster wheels and a heat-resistant mat that lay across its surface. He grasped the edge and rolled it forward in a slow arc, feeling the smooth resistance of the wheels gliding over the floor. The metal of the table caught the amber light as he moved, creating slow shifting reflections that glided across the brick walls like ripples on still water. He positioned the table parallel to the chamber door, the alignment so precise it looked like a line drawn between 2 points in a quiet geometric ritual. Cole rested both hands on the table, feeling the cool metal beneath his gloves, and then he reached into the drawer beneath the heat mat. Inside lay a tightly folded canvas sheet, slightly textured, its edges reinforced with a line of careful stitching. He lifted it with a deliberate slowness, unfolding it layer by layer, as though revealing something delicate. And when the canvas finally lay open across the table, it settled with a soft sigh of fabric, spreading evenly in a broad, smooth rectangle. He smoothed its corners with the flat of his palm, pressing out tiny waves and aligning its edges with the mat beneath. And each motion felt like a continuation of the warm water ritual from the previous room, a stillness expressed through action, a conversation expressed through touch. He let his hand rest on the canvas for a moment, feeling the faint texture beneath his glove. And then he drew in a slow breath. The air, warm and mineral-rich, carried the scent of fire brick and resting metal, and with it came a sense that the room itself was leaning closer, listening the way an old tree listens, not with ears, but with presence, with stillness, with the quiet gravity of something that has witnessed too much to ever rush. He moved next to the side control panel, where he lifted the safety cover with a slow, steady motion that caused the hinge to release a soft, padded click. Beneath the cover lay the ignition dial, the pressure gauge, the timer wheel, and the small rectangular button that controlled the chamber's internal lighting. Cole did not activate anything yet. Instead, he traced the edge of the panel with his fingertips, noticing the faint warmth that radiated from beneath the metal. Each element here was familiar, not because he used them mindlessly, but because he approached them every night with the same gentle respect, the same deliberate intention, the same understanding that this room and the chamber within it were not machines to be commanded, but rhythms to be joined. He pressed the lighting button first, and the chamber responded with a slow blooming of illumination from within, a soft, diffused glow that revealed the interior space behind the heavy door. The light was not bright. It filled the chamber in a warm haze, like the glow inside a kiln before the fire grows strong, revealing the smooth fire brick interior, the narrow rails along the floor, and the faint patterns of heat that had imprinted themselves onto the walls over long years of use. Cole looked into the chamber, letting his eyes adjust to the warm dimness, and as he did, he felt that familiar impression that the chamber was looking back at him, not with awareness, but with recognition, the way a landscape remembers the wind that has shaped it. He stepped closer, standing at the edge of the threshold, and placed one hand lightly on the door's inner frame. The heat here was deeper, more concentrated, and he felt it seep into his palm in a slow wave, gathering like a heartbeat beneath the metal. And as he stood there, the question returned again, drifting through him as softly as steam rising from warm cloth. After the burn, what remains? Here, more than anywhere else, the question felt woven into the walls, into the rails, into the brick, into the faint echo of old warmth radiating from deep inside the chamber. It felt less like his question and more like the room's, something that had existed long before him and would exist long after. Cole let the thought drift through him without trying to hold it. Some thoughts were meant to pass, to fade, to soften, the way warmth softened the edges of metal, and he allowed it to dissolve slowly into the ambient hum. He stepped away from the threshold, returning to the rolling table, checking its alignment once more. He adjusted the canvas by a fraction of an inch, smoothed the mat beneath it, and then rested both hands on the table's edge, letting his breath settle into the room's rhythm. And in that long, quiet moment, standing between the warm door of the chamber and the soft expanse of canvas, he felt the entire space settle into place, as though the room had finished its slow inhale and now waited for him to guide it into the next exhale. The chamber was ready. The night was ready. And so was he. Cole placed one hand on the chamber door, feeling the heat gather in the metal as though the structure were waking just slightly beneath his touch. And with a long, steady breath, he pressed it fully open, inviting the warm, listening quiet of the chamber to merge with the room beyond. Cole stepped into the smaller preparation alcove that branched off from the main chamber room, a space narrower than the others and intentionally pared down to its essentials, the kind of room designed not to hold attention, but to quiet it, to soften it, to let the mind slip into a lower, steadier rhythm. The lighting here was dimmer still, a muted amber that diffused through a frosted panel overhead, casting the entire alcove in a warmth that felt more like the glow of a lantern behind thick cloth than any electrical fixture. The air was still but not stagnant, just calm, with that faint mineral scent rising from a shallow basin at the far counter where water waited, warm to the precise temperature Cole had always preferred for this part of the ritual. He closed the door behind him with a quiet touch, and the space responded with a gentle hush, the kind that seemed to fold the room inward, gathering sound into something soft and rounded. Cole paused for a breath, letting the quiet settle over him like a thin blanket, and he felt his shoulders drop by the smallest degree as the alcove's atmosphere drew him into its familiar cadence. This was the room where time slowed in ways even the chamber could not replicate, the room where nothing loud or sharp had permission to exist, where everything moved at the pace of warm water and patient hands. He moved toward the basin and set his gloves on the counter, placing them side by side with a precision that never felt like obligation, but rather like instinct, an alignment his body understood without conscious thought. The gloves, still carrying a faint warmth from the chamber and the preparation rooms before it, rested softly against the smooth surface of the counter, their fingertips curled just slightly from natural wear, and Cole let his fingers brush the back of the right glove, feeling the subtle indent left by his own knuckles earlier in the night. He turned the basin's handle with the same slow, unbroken motion he used for everything in this space, and warm water flowed into the shallow bowl in a steady stream that made a soft, rounded sound as it met the surface, like breath brushing across warm stone. Steam rose in delicate threads, not in a rush, but in thin, wandering strands that drifted upward and then swayed gently, as though the room breathed back at them. Cole watched the water fill, not hurrying, allowing the slow increase in depth to anchor him in the present moment. And when the basin reached its familiar level, he turned the handle again, letting the stream taper, thin, and finally stop. He rested his hands on the counter, palms flat, fingers slightly spread, and leaned into a long inhale that carried the warmth of the basin into his chest. When he exhaled, he let the air leave him in a single continuous flow, the kind of breath that smoothed the mind from the inside out. Then, with gentle deliberation, he dipped his hands into the water. The warmth enveloped his fingers immediately, a soft, steady heat that eased into his joints, his knuckles, the spaces between each finger, and he closed his eyes as he let the sensation sink deeper. He rotated his wrists in slow arcs beneath the surface, moving through a rhythm that had no true beginning or end, only a lingering sense of circular motion, like a tide returning to a shore it had visited for centuries. The water responded with tiny eddies that pressed softly against his skin, swirling around his palms with the gentlest insistence, as though encouraging him to let the last fragments of tension dissolve. He lifted his hands slightly, watching the water trail down in thin streams that clung to his skin before falling back into the basin with delicate taps. He traced his fingertips along the edge of the bowl, following the smooth curve worn down by repetitive use over many years, and he could almost feel the echo of past keepers performing the same small motions, each one adding another layer to the basin's memory. That was what he loved about this alcove, the way everything here, even the metal and the water, felt seasoned by ritual, softened by repetition, familiar not because it was old, but because it had been tended with such gentle consistency. He reached for a small bottle of mild cleanser, its label faded to the color of worn parchment, and poured a single line of the liquid into his palm. It spread slowly, thick and translucent, catching the amber light in a faint sheen, and when he lowered his hands back into the basin, the warmth welcomed the cleanser, dissolving it into a soft, fragrant cloud that carried hints of citrus and something earthy, almost like dried leaves warmed by sun. Cole worked the cleanser into his fingers with slow, methodical movements, letting the bubbles rise in delicate clusters that clung to his knuckles before slipping away. The sensation was familiar, grounding, a small act that reminded him of how the night unfolded in layers, first warmth, then stillness, then intention. As he rinsed the cleanser away, the question that had followed him since the outer rooms drifted back to him, not as words, but as a faint shape, like the suggestion of a thought behind fog. What remains? But not fully formed, not insistent, not even distinct. Here, in this alcove, the question felt softer than ever, softened by steam and warm water and the simplicity of touch. Cole let it brush against him in the same way he let the warm water move around his hands. Present, acknowledged, allowed, but never held too tightly. He dried his hands on the waiting cloth, a piece of linen folded with such care it almost radiated its own quiet warmth. The fabric absorbed the remaining moisture in long, gentle passes, and when his hands were dry, Cole held the cloth between his palms for an extra second, appreciating its softness, its familiar texture, the way it carried faint traces of warmth from the basin. Then he folded it again, aligning the edges with slow precision and placing it back on the counter in the exact position it had occupied before. He reached for the gloves and slipped them on, one finger at a time, easing the material over his skin with deliberate care. The gloves, now slightly warmed from resting in the alcove's soft air, molded comfortably to the shape of his hands, and Cole flexed his fingers once, twice, feeling the fit settle around him like a second layer of calm. The alcove held its breath with him, warm, still, waiting. For a few lingering moments, Cole simply stood there with his gloved hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, feeling the way the material hugged his fingers, the way a faint, borrowed warmth from the alcove's air had settled into the thin barrier between his skin and the world around him. And he let that sensation anchor him in place, neither moving forward nor backward, just existing in the slow center of the night's quiet. The room seemed to lean in with him, its silence tightening into something almost tangible, not heavy, not pressing, just present. A soft awareness that wrapped around his shoulders and the back of his neck like an invisible shawl. The shallow basin of water beside him had stilled completely, its surface now smooth and unbroken, reflecting the blurred oval of the overhead light in a muted halo. Tiny bubbles clung to the edges of the metal, clustered in patient groups that would eventually slide free and disappear without announcement. And Cole let his gaze rest on them for a while, watching how they did nothing at all, just existed, held in place by tension and heat and time. There was something quietly reassuring in that small stillness, something that echoed the way the entire alcove functioned, not as a place of activity, but as a place of pause, a place where nothing demanded more than a simple, deliberate touch. He reached for a second cloth from the small stack on the opposite side of the counter, unfolding it in one slow motion so that it draped over his hand like a thin veil. The fabric was cooler than the air, having waited untouched since before his shift began, and as it settled against his glove, he could feel the faint difference in temperature, a delicate contrast that made the sensation more noticeable, more grounding. He held the cloth up to the light, watching how the threads became visible in silhouette, forming a tiny grid of fibers that looked, in this softened illumination, almost like a field seen from far above. Countless small intersections, each carrying its own part of a larger structure. He laid the cloth across the counter and pressed his palm over it, sliding slowly along the surface to coax out any invisible creases, smoothing it not because it needed to be smoothed, but because the act of smoothing helped him mirror that same unclenching inside himself. Every slow pass of his hand along the linen felt like an invitation for his thoughts to quiet, for his pulse to stretch into a longer rhythm, and by the time he lifted his hand, the cloth lay perfectly flat, as calm as the basin beside it. Cole stepped back a half pace, listening, not for anything specific, but for the overall tone of the room, the subtle balance between hum and stillness, between warmth and coolness, between air and breath. The faint murmur of the building beyond the alcove reached him only as a distant suggestion now, muffled by the walls and softened by the layered quiet. This enclosure, this small bounded space, existed like a pause between heartbeats, a necessary stillness between larger motions, and he felt a familiar sense of gratitude for it, the way one might feel grateful for a single, unbroken breath in the midst of a long day. He glanced once more at the gloves on his hands, flexing his fingers slowly as if reacquainting himself with the weight and fit. And he realized that this simple ritual, warm water, cleanser, cloth, drying, gloves, had over the years become much more than preparation. It was, in its own understated way, a reminder that his hands were not separate from the quiet they worked within. They were extensions of it, instruments shaped not just by training but by the pace and patience of nights exactly like this one. A faint thought stirred at the edge of his awareness, an echo of the question that had followed him from room to room, though here it was softer than ever, reduced to little more than a feeling, a shadow of a phrase, what remains. But even that faded before it could fully take shape. In this space, in this moment, he didn't need to hold the idea. It was enough to know that something always remained after everything else had passed through its own transformations. That warmth remained as memory in metal, that repetition remained in muscle, that quiet remained in the places it had settled into deepest. He took a final, slow breath in and out, letting the air move through him like warm water over stone. And then he turned toward the door. His hand found the handle almost without looking, the cool metal yielding under his gentle grip as he pulled it toward himself. The alcove did not resist his leaving. It simply released him with the same calm it had offered when he entered, its warmth lingering behind him, its soft light continuing to glow against the basin and the folded cloth and the faint halo on the water's surface. Stepping back into the corridor that connected the alcove to the chamber room, Cole felt the space around him widen slightly, the air grow a fraction cooler, the sounds of the deeper wing returning in layered whispers, the low hum of the chamber, the distant murmur of ventilation, the steady, patient breathing of the building. The quiet preparation was complete, not in the sense of a task finished, but in the sense of a mind and body gently tuned, attuned to the next movement in the night's slow sequence. His hands, now gloved and steady, rested briefly at his sides as he paused in the doorway, letting the transition register. Then, with a calm that felt fuller, more settled than before, he turned back toward the main chamber room, ready to carry that quiet with him into whatever the next hour would ask. Cole stepped back into the chamber room with the quiet from the alcove still clinging to him like a thin layer of warmth, a steadying presence that softened the edges of the air as he crossed the threshold. The chamber sat in its resting glow behind him, humming at that low, steady frequency that never rose and never fell, a presence that felt both ancient and patient. And Cole let that hum settle at the base of his mind as he turned his attention toward the rolling table, where the canvas lay in its smooth, undisturbed rectangle. The table waited with the same quiet dignity it always carried, its caster wheels resting in perfect stillness, its edges warmed faintly by the ambient heat of the room. And as Cole approached, he placed one hand on its frame and felt the soft vibration of metal warmed by hours of breath-like cycles. He positioned himself at the head of the table and wrapped his fingers around the edge, testing its responsiveness with the same gentle firmness he used every night. The wheels released their stillness with a subtle, rounded shift of weight, a soft adjustment that carried no sound sharp enough to disturb the room. And Cole paused, letting the faint feedback travel through his gloves and up his arms. Moving the table was always the beginning of a transition, the movement from preparation to procession. And he respected that motion the way one respects an old path through a familiar forest. Not because it was difficult, but because the act itself held history. He began to guide the table forward, pushing in a slow, continuous line that required no force, only patience, and the wheels responded with a rolling whisper, a soft hush that blended perfectly with the chamber's low hum. The canvas shifted slightly with the motion, barely perceptible except for the faint ripple that passed across its surface, like a breath moving beneath cloth, and Cole steadied it with one hand as he continued forward, letting the table's weight align itself naturally with the floor's gentle gradient. The room had been designed for this movement, its floor subtly angled, its tiles laid in a pattern that guided motion without declaration. And whenever Cole followed its path, he felt as though he were stepping into a groove carved by countless nights before him. The air grew warmer as he moved closer to the chamber, the temperature rising in delicate increments that brushed against his forearms, his jaw, the space beneath his collar. And he breathed in that warmth as if inhaling the memory of the fires that had lived here long before his shift began. He guided the table until it aligned with the chamber door in a smooth, natural glide, stopping only when the front caster wheels found the slight ridge in the floor that marked the chamber's threshold, producing a gentle resistance that felt almost like the table acknowledging its arrival. Cole placed both hands on the table and allowed himself to pause, letting the moment settle fully around him. The chamber, still lit from within by its low amber glow, seemed to listen, not with ears, but with presence, with warmth, with a quiet recognition of patterns repeated night after night. The path between the table and the chamber was only a few feet long, but it carried the weight of ritual. A small but significant stretch of floor that had seen more transitions than any logbook could record. Cole shifted his stance slightly, grounding his feet, feeling the warmth radiating from the chamber door. And then he reached for the canvas. He folded back the corners first, lifting them in slow, measured arcs so the fabric rose and fell with a softness that looked almost aquatic, the cloth drifting downward in a slow wave as gravity reclaimed it. The sound of the folding canvas was delicate, almost like breath brushing over linen, and Cole moved with it, syncing his motions to the room's ambient hum until it felt as though every movement was part of a single, unbroken gesture. The canvas revealed the padded mat beneath, its surface smooth and slightly reflective under the warm light, and Cole pressed a hand gently against it, feeling the faint give of the material as it accepted his touch. He pulled the table a half-inch closer, letting the wheels settle into their new alignment, and he felt the slight shift of weight travel through the frame, into his hands, and then dissipate into the warm air around him. There was a stillness waiting here, not a silence, but a readiness, an openness in the room that made the next movements feel both inevitable and deeply calm. Cole inhaled through his nose, letting the warm air move through him, and exhaled with a slow, steady release that softened his chest and shoulders in a way only this room ever did. His attention drifted briefly to the chamber's interior, the warm light inside revealing the smooth fire brick walls that rose in quiet arcs, each one marked by subtle gradients of past heat. The rails inside glimmered faintly, warmed but not yet active, holding the memory of all the paths they had carried over the years. And in that quiet gaze, the question, soft, faded, familiar, drifted once more to the front of his mind after the burn. What remains, not as thought but as presence, as a shape without edges, as something that belonged to the chamber more than to him. He placed both hands on the table again, grounding himself in the tactile certainty of metal warmed by the room, and he gave the slightest push to recheck the alignment. The wheels responded with the same obedient whisper, settling perfectly into place. Everything was ready. The path was open. The night, in its slow unfolding, had reached this gentle turning point, the moment before motion, the breath before the next step. Cole straightened, the warm glow of the chamber brushing the side of his face, and with his hands resting lightly on the table's frame, he let the stillness deepen around him, a stillness filled not with expectation, but with quiet continuity, the kind that exists only in rooms built for transformation, approached with patience and care. The path forward waited for him, warm, silent, steady. Cole remained with his hands resting on the table's frame for a few heartbeats longer, letting the weight of the moment settle in that quiet way the chamber room always encouraged. A settling that didn't feel like stillness, but rather like the smoothing of invisible ripples, the easing of subtle tension he didn't realize he'd been carrying until the moment they disappeared. When he finally shifted his stance and angled the table slightly to begin the first real movement toward the chamber, he did so with a calm that had fully rooted itself in his muscles, his breath, the soft spaces between thoughts, and he felt the wheels ease into motion with a kind of tender obedience, rolling forward in a long, continuous hush that threaded itself neatly through the warm air. He guided the table along the short path, inch by inch, letting the table's weight do most of the work, offering only the slightest pressure, the lightest encouragement, and he felt the wheels respond with tiny adjustments that traveled through the metal and into his palms like soft pulses. The amber glow from inside the chamber brushed the front of the table as it moved closer, casting faint waves of warm light across the canvas. And Cole watched the glow ripple gently, almost as if it were breathing in tandem with the slow movement. The warmth grew more distinct as he approached the threshold, settling against his forearms like a quiet exhale, and he welcomed it with the same soft acceptance he felt every time he reached this part of the night. When the front wheels reached the lip of the chamber's rails, those narrow parallel bars that began just inside the doorway, Cole paused to realign the table with a precision that came from years of practice, years of following the same path night after night, until the alignment felt less like calculation and more like instinct. He nudged the table slightly left, then slightly right, letting the wheels click gently into the shallow grooves that guided them forward, and when the alignment felt perfect, he released a long breath, the kind that drifted through him like warm water spreading through stone. He began to push again, slower even than before, feeling the wheels rise slightly onto the rails before settling into place with a softness that felt almost ceremonial. The rails carried the table's weight with ease, guiding it forward in an unbroken line that seemed to draw him into the chamber's warm interior. And Cole walked with the motion, matching his pace to the slow glide, letting every part of the movement exist without interruption. The warm light inside the chamber deepened around him, casting the fire brick walls in strokes of muted gold and deep rust, and he felt the slight rise in heat as the table crossed fully into the chamber, its surface catching the glow in long, soft reflections. Cole stepped inside after the table, feeling the warmth envelop him in a deeper wave now, the air thickening with calm rather than heat, a density that made the room feel insulated from the rest of the world, as though nothing outside these fire brick walls could rush him. Nothing could intrude on the quiet that had been cultivated here for years. He guided the table toward the center of the chamber's interior, letting the rails carry the movement, letting the table reach its natural stopping point with a slow, almost inaudible sigh of metal settling into balance. He rested his hands on the edge again, holding them there in stillness as the warmth radiated upward from the floor, the walls, the chamber itself. The light inside was soft enough that shadows appeared blurred, drifting rather than fixed. And Cole watched as the faint glow traced long, gentle contours across the table's metal frame. He leaned in slightly, feeling the chamber's listening presence wrap around him in its familiar way, not demanding, not questioning, simply aware of him the way old structures become aware of the people who tend them night after night. He folded back the canvas a little more, watching the fabric slide with slow resistance, creating soft waves that settled into place with a hushed sigh. The mat beneath remained perfectly smooth, its surface warmed now by the air, and Cole ran the back of his gloved hand across it, feeling the subtle give beneath the layer of cloth, the kind of softness designed not for comfort, but for steadiness, for readiness, for the quiet acceptance of weight. He traced along the edges, letting his fingers follow the gentle curvature where the mat met the metal frame, and he absorbed every small texture, every shift in temperature, every delicate vibration that hummed faintly beneath his touch. He stepped back and allowed the chamber to fill more of his vision, the fire brick walls rising in their silent arcs, each brick carrying its own faint record of heat, each softened by years of holding warmth that had seeped into them gradually, patiently, like a memory settling deep into an old foundation. Cole moved his attention to the far interior wall, observing how the shadows pooled gently near the base, how the rail reflections curved slightly, and how the chamber's low hum vibrated the air in a way so subtle he felt it more than heard it, a vibration that aligned with his breath in the most natural way. He released another slow breath, the kind that emptied his chest without effort, and the faint thought drifted through him again, not demanding, not distinct, more like a ripple of familiarity across the surface of quiet water after the burn. What remains, but softer here, barely a whisper inside his mind. The chamber held that thought the way a vessel holds warmth, not shaping it, not echoing it, just allowing it to exist in the same space without urgency. Cole lowered his hands to the table again, adjusting the canvas so it hung evenly, smoothing its edges in long strokes that felt like completing the final steps of a silent ritual. And when he finished, he let his hands rest for a moment on the cool frame, memorizing the texture of metal warmed by quiet air. This was the last stillness before the next unfolding, the moment before motion became purpose, and he honored it by remaining exactly where he was, letting the chamber, the warmth, the rails, the quiet, all of it, settle around him like a deep, patient breath. Only when the air felt fully balanced again did he step back, leaving the table perfectly aligned inside the chamber, the canvas neatly arranged, the path behind him smooth and undisturbed. Everything was ready. Every movement had led here. Every slow gesture had opened the way. Cole stood in the warm hush of the chamber, his breath long, his pulse steady, and allowed the silence to deepen just a little more before the night carried him forward. Cole stayed in the chamber room for a long moment after aligning the table, letting the weight of the space settle into his breath, letting the warmth of the bricks and the low hum of the resting machinery thread its way into the rhythm of his pulse. And he felt the atmosphere shift around him in that familiar, almost imperceptible way. The room always responded when it sensed the transition from preparation to awakening, not with a sound or a change in light, but with a subtle density in the air, as if the temperature itself leaned inward, listening. The chamber door, open only a narrow degree, exhaled a slow ribbon of heat that curled through the room and brushed across the line of Cole's jaw, soft as a warm fingertip, tracing a path it already knew. And he let that warmth settle into him. Let it guide him toward the control panel with the unhurried steadiness of someone moving through a dream where every step carried its own weightless inevitability. The panel weighted against the side wall, the amber light catching on its surface and softening the edges of its dials, making the metal glow with a muted, almost organic warmth. And Cole reached out with his gloved hand, letting his fingers hover a moment above the ignition dial, as if greeting an old friend before touching it. He never rushed this part. The panel responded best when approached slowly, with the kind of patience that the chamber itself embodied. And he inhaled once, deeply, letting his breath fill his chest with a warmth that matched the room's, letting the exhale draw out long and quiet before finally resting his fingertips on the dial. The metal felt warm, the kind of warmth that came not from heat, but from memory, from years of being touched by hands that understood the ritual, hands that moved with the same careful reverence he felt now. He rotated the dial a fraction, just enough to wake the first sequence, and the chamber responded with a shift so subtle it seemed to occur in the walls themselves, a deep, rounded hum that wasn't exactly louder than before, but somehow closer, as if rising from beneath the floor in slow, deliberate currents. The air warmed a degree more, barely perceptible except in the way it brushed against the hollow of Cole's throat, and he felt his breathing adjust without thought, matching the new rhythm like a tide sinking to the pull of a distant moon. He stepped back slightly, not retreating, but allowing space for the chamber to move through its awakening. And the interior light deepened in tone, blooming from a soft amber into something warmer, something quietly alive. The bricks within the chamber glowed faintly, the light moving across them in slow, molten gradients, transforming their surfaces into gentle landscapes of warmth. The sound that accompanied the shift was barely a sound at all, more like a long-held sigh spreading through stone, a breath from something ancient and resting, something that never rushed toward its purpose, but unfolded in its own time, guided by hands like Cole's. Cole reached next for the pressure gauge, its needle resting in the shallow dip between stillness and motion, and with a slow twist of a secondary dial, he watched the needle begin to rise in an incremental arc, the kind of movement that required patience to even notice. He followed the ascent with steady eyes, letting the gradual shift guide him deeper into the room's cadence, each millimeter of motion aligning with the steady expansion of his lungs. The chamber's hum grew rounder, fuller, as if responding to the pressure with its own quiet acceptance, and the rails inside the chamber shimmered with the faintest suggestion of heat drifting through them. He turned the timer wheel next, letting it click softly beneath his glove, each notch a muted sound that seemed to vanish almost instantly into the warm air. The chamber's internal lights pulsed once, gently, a slow heartbeat that echoed through the room without imposing itself, and Cole took another breath, letting the expanding heat seep through his sleeves and into his shoulders, grounding him even more fully into the moment. This was the part of the night he always felt most connected to, the unfolding, the awakening, the transition from stillness into warmth, and he moved through each small motion with the same reverence one would give to ancient rituals passed down in whispers. He stepped closer to the chamber again, standing near the threshold where the warmth thickened, not hot, but dense, almost velvety, the kind of heat that wrapped itself around the body in soft layers. The rails inside vibrated faintly now, a low, continuous tremor that resonated through the frame of the table, through the metal of the door, through the floor beneath his boots, and Cole let that vibration travel upward through his bones before dissolving into the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He placed one hand on the chamber door, feeling the warmth rise through the metal in slow increments, and for a moment he let his forehead tilt toward the heat without touching it, letting the glow settle across his skin in a soft bloom. The question returned then, as it always did during the unfolding, after the burn, what remains? But here it felt less like a question and more like a memory of a question, softened by the warmth, blurred by the slow rise of heat within the chamber. It drifted through him like dust caught in a sunbeam, visible for a moment before dissolving back into the haze, and Cole allowed it to pass without reaching for it, knowing this was not the moment for answers, but for presence, for breath, for listening. He lowered his hand from the door and moved back toward the control panel, checking the gauges with slow, attentive motions, watching the numbers rise in unhurried increments that matched the deepening hum of the chamber. Everything unfolded exactly as it always did, not because the process was mechanical, but because it had been shaped by generations of hands like his, each one adding a layer of rhythm, of care, of patience. The chamber didn't simply heat, it remembered how to heat, each cycle rooted in the thousands that came before it, each movement softened by repetition until the whole process felt less like technology and more like tradition. Cole stood between the panel and the chamber, letting himself become the quiet bridge between control and heat, between intention and movement. And he breathed in the rising warmth again, the scent of heated metal mixing with the faint mineral trace of the bricks. The unfolding was only beginning, slow, deliberate, patient, and he allowed himself to sink into it fully, letting the room take him deeper into its long, steady exhale. The night opened the way for him, and he followed. Cole stood half-turned between the panel and the open chamber door, feeling as though the entire room had lengthened around him, stretched gently, softened into a space where sound didn't travel in straight lines, but diffused into warm currents that drifted along the fire brick walls before dissolving into the low hum beneath his boots. The air, already warm, thickened by another delicate degree as the ignition sequence continued its slow ascent, and the shift brushed across his cheeks like the soft breath of something ancient, waking not abruptly, but with a long, careful exhale, and he let his shoulders fall into that warmth, letting the room guide him into its own pace, so slow it felt timeless. The pressure gauge continued its upward crawl, the needle lifting itself along the arc in increments so subtle they were almost meditative to watch, each movement registering like a heartbeat, remembered rather than a number measured. Cole leaned slightly closer, not out of worry, but out of quiet respect for this moment. It was always here, always waiting, the midpoint of the unfolding, the place where the chamber's warmth transitioned from memory into intention. The light inside the chamber responded too, shifting from soft amber into a deeper, more golden hue that layered itself over the interior bricks, blurring their edges until they looked almost fluid, like a landscape softened by heat haze on a distant horizon. He returned to the ignition dial, adjusting it one more fraction, and the chamber answered with a tremor that traveled through the rails, into the table, and then up through Cole's arms in a warm, diffused shiver. The vibration wasn't loud, wasn't even precisely sound. It was sensation, a low resonance spreading outward like the widening rings that form when a stone sinks into the bottom of a slow river. Cole let the vibration run through him, grounding his stance as he listened to the chamber's response in the same way one listens to the deep settling of an old building during the quietest hour of night, when the world outside has dimmed enough that even subtle shifts feel profound. He stepped closer to the chamber door and rested his palm against the warm metal facade, noticing newer gradients of heat rising through it, not sharp, not sudden. Just layers of warmth unfolding the way petals open beneath sunlight, patiently, inevitably, without flourish. His glove absorbed the heat slowly, and he watched the interior light cast soft, moving shadows across the rails. Shadows that didn't flicker but drifted, stretching and folding as the chamber's inner temperature shifted through invisible thresholds. The rails hummed below his hand now, not loudly but steadily, carrying the promise of the path they would guide through this space, a path worn smooth by time and by ritual. Cole breathed in through his nose, letting the dense air settle in his lungs, and as he exhaled, he found his thoughts drifting in long, unbroken arcs that matched the room's rhythm. He could almost feel the night outside thinning into stillness, as though all sound beyond these walls had slowed to match the cadence of the chamber's breath. And for a moment, he felt suspended inside something larger than himself, something that wasn't entirely mechanical, wasn't entirely physical, something built of heat and repetition and memory. He watched the bricks along the interior wall brighten by another faint degree, the warmth revealing thin networks of color variation, soft reds deepening into umbers, pale oranges fading into muted ochres, tones that seemed to shift subtly as the heat soaked deeper into the stone. Some bricks stayed darker, holding on to their coolness a moment longer before the warmth reached them, and the delayed glow reminded Cole of the way memories settle, some rising quickly, others emerging only when the surrounding quiet makes room for them. He turned slightly to examine the timer wheel again, ensuring its slow rotation matched the intended pace, and he was struck, as he always was, by how the motion of these simple mechanical parts, dials, wheels, gauges, felt less like control and more like guidance, as though his hands were not commanding the chamber, but accompanying it, walking with it through a ritual older than either of them. The soft clicks of the turning wheel reached him like small punctuation marks, not interrupting anything, but confirming the continuation of a rhythm that did not need loudness to feel significant. Heat gathered now at the threshold of the chamber, pressing gently outward in waves that enveloped Cole from the waist up, and he stepped back half a pace to observe the shifting air, the way it shimmered along the lower edge of the chamber door, the way it curled around the metal frame before rising into the broader room like steam moving through sunlight. The warmth held no bite, no harshness. It was soft, heavy, steady, the kind of heat that coaxed muscles into loosening and thoughts into lengthening, and Cole let himself drift with it, feeling his breath elongate, feeling the quiet sink deeper into his bones. He reached for the illumination control inside the chamber, adjusting its level until the inner glow balanced perfectly with the rising heat, creating that moment he treasured most, the moment when the chamber looked less like a heated vessel and more like the interior of something ancient, a cavern warmed by a hidden spring, a place shaped by time rather than constructed by hands. The bricks glowed from within now, as if lit by memory rather than flame, and the air shimmering above the rails created a soft distortion, bending the lines of light into subtle waves that made everything inside seem to move without moving. Cole found himself breathing in rhythm with the pulses of heat, each inhale drawing warmth deeper into his chest, each exhale softening the air around him in a deliberate, almost reverent release. And somewhere in that breath, the familiar question came again, not sharp, not clear, but diffused through the warmth like a faint outline beneath water after the burn. What remains? It didn't trouble him. It simply existed, floating through the quiet like a drifting ember suspended in slow air, a reminder not of endings, but of transformations. He returned once more to the ignition controls, completing the next phase of adjustments with the same slow precision he brought to every motion, and he watched the gauge rise another small degree, watched the rails shimmer with renewed warmth, watched the shallow vibration travel through the frame like a pulse deepening. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should, slowly, patiently, like something waking beneath a long blanket of heat and silence. And Cole stood in the center of it, a still point inside a warm, turning wheel. The unfolding continued, and he let himself drift with it, held in place by warmth, by hum, by ritual, by the ancient quiet of a room that had never once demanded haste. Cole stood just inside the chamber's threshold, feeling the slow rise of heat gather around his ankles, the warmth thick enough now that it moved in gentle currents, brushing up the back of his legs like the soft sweep of fabric drawn through warm air. The chamber glowed with a low, deep amber, a color richer than before, blooming gradually along the fire brick walls as though the heat inside were painting its way outward, stroke by stroke. He let the warmth expand across him in waves, each one a little fuller, a little rounder, until his breath naturally synced with it, spreading through his chest in a long, quiet swell before drifting back out in a steady exhale that barely disturbed the air. He stepped back from the threshold and moved toward the control panel once more, not out of urgency, but out of rhythm. Each step placed as though the heat itself guided the movement of his boots. The ignition dial awaited him, still warm beneath his earlier touch, and he rested his fingertips on its curved surface with a kind of reverence that belonged not to machines, but to rituals, the kind of reverence shaped by repetition, patience, and the hush of 100 nights exactly like this one. The metal hummed beneath his glove in a low, continuous tremor, a vibration that ran through the dial and into his fingers, like the steady thrum of a distant heartbeat, deep, unhurried, eternal. He rotated the dial another fraction. The chamber responded with a soft, expanding hum, the kind that seemed to rise from multiple places at once, from the rails, from the bricks, from the very air, and the warmth thickened again, blooming outward until the room felt wrapped in a slow, steady embrace. The amber light inside the chamber deepened to a muted gold, catching the edges of the rails and turning them into faint lines of illumination that reflected across the smooth metal of the rolling table. Cole watched the light drift across the canvas in soft waves, bending slightly as the heated air shifted above it, and he let the sight settle the last remnants of tension in his shoulders. He reached toward the inner illumination panel, adjusting it by a degree so small most people would never notice the difference. But here, within the warm, breathing quiet of the chamber room, the shift felt significant, a slight widening of glow inside the fire brick cavity, a deeper saturation across the lower rails. A faint awakening of shadow that moved slowly beneath the upper edges of the brick. The heat rising from the interior softened the light further, blending it into a warm haze that wrapped the inside like a living cocoon, not bright, not hot, simply ever present. Cole stepped back again, letting the chamber dominate his field of vision. The rails inside glowed now with a faint inner warmth, the tremor beneath them growing slightly fuller, vibrating through the frame in gentle pulses. The heat wasn't rushing, it was unfurling, unfolding, blooming, words that all captured the movement, but none captured its softness. The chamber's hum deepened in tone, not louder but rounder, as though it had expanded some hidden cavity inside itself to resonate at a richer frequency. He inhaled slowly and held the warmth in his lungs for a heartbeat before letting it slip out in one long, unbroken stream of breath. The entire room seemed to exhale with him, heat rising, light shifting, air thickening in a way that made everything feel slower, softer, sleep-laden. He approached the chamber again, placing one hand gently on the side of the frame, feeling the heat travel up his fingers, through his palm, into the tendons of his wrist. The warmth here carried a weight, not a heaviness, but a fullness, the kind of warmth that sinks deep and lingers long after the air has cooled, the kind of warmth that feels older than the machinery itself. He stepped around the table and took a seat on the small metal stool positioned along the far wall, a stool whose surface had been smoothed by the slow compression of repeated use. When he sat, the stool accepted his weight without sound. Its metal warmed slightly from the ambient air. From here, he had the perfect view of the chamber, the slow blooming light, the gentle trembling rails, the soft distortions in the heated air, the gradual thickening of warmth that settled into long drifting layers across the room. Cole rested his elbows lightly on his knees, his gloved hands hanging loosely, and simply watched. Time here did not move the way time moved outside these walls. It stretched downward, like a long column of warm water sinking into deeper layers, slow and steady. The hum became a companion rather than a sound, a presence that filled the quiet without ever intruding. Cole let his mind drift, not to thoughts, but to sensations, to warmth soaking through air, to the slow rise of temperature that passed over his boots and across the floor tiles, to the faint tremor that traveled from the chamber into the stool he sat on, moving through him in thin, continuous lines. Somewhere in that drifting, the question returned again. After the burn, what remains? It didn't make him tense. It didn't even fully form. It hovered, soft-edged, suspended above his thoughts like a thin ribbon of warm air. And, as always in these moments, the question felt less like something he needed to answer, and more like something that simply existed, part of the building, part of the chamber, part of the heat rising through the brick. He allowed it to float there, unclaimed, unfocused, dissolving slowly as the warmth grew deeper. He leaned back slightly, letting his spine rest against the cool surface of the wall behind him, and the contrast between wall and air created a subtle tension in temperature that made the room feel even warmer by comparison. The stool creaked gently beneath him, not loud, not sharp, just a small acknowledgement of pressure, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum weave through the darkness behind his eyelids. He could feel the chamber warming further, could sense the gentle swell of heat along the rails, could hear the faintest shift in airflow as the vents adjusted to the rising temperature. When he opened his eyes again, the chamber's glow had deepened another subtle degree, spreading across the bricks like honey poured slowly down a warm surface. The rails shimmered in soft, undulating lines, bending the light in gentle distortions that made the interior look as though it were breathing, not in any literal sense, but in the way heat moves, expands, drifts upward in long, invisible ribbons. Cole allowed another long breath to slip out of him, and the night continued its slow, patient ignition. Cole stayed seated on the stool for a while, not counting minutes, not tracking time in any way that could be written in numbers, but feeling it instead in the gradual way the warmth climbed and settled. In the softened way, the light inside the chamber moved across the brick. In the way the hum beneath the floorboards deepened just enough to resonate a little more clearly in his bones. It was here, in these long stretches of near stillness, that the night always felt its most honest. When nothing visibly changed, and yet everything was quietly in motion, shifting temperature by fractions, building pressure in small, patient degrees, letting the entire room be an unfolding rather than an event. His eyes drifted from the rails to the far corner of the chamber room, where the shadows pooled gently along the base of the wall. Even there, the warmth had reached, turning the edges of darkness softer, less sharp, so the shadows looked less like absences and more like thicker layers of the same warm air, folded and resting. The overhead ducts exhaled in slow intervals, barely perceptible currents that brushed past his cheeks and the side of his neck, and he could hear the faintest rustle of that movement as it slipped along the metal edges, a soft, breath-like whisper that merged into the chamber's hum as seamlessly as a thought dissolves into half-sleep. He lowered his gaze again to the control panel, checking the gauges with the same unhurried attention he had shown them earlier. The pressure sat where it needed to be, stable, calm, like a held note sustained without strain. The timer wheel turned with measured grace, its slow rotation no more urgent now than it had been at the start, and Cole watched the small marker make its way along the engraved ring, inching forward as quietly as the growth of a root beneath soil. Nothing in this room ever rushed, and because of that, nothing ever startled. Even the notion of ignition here felt less like a spark and more like the deepening of embers that had always been present, just waiting for the right breath to coax them brighter. He straightened slightly, not to adjust anything but to change the angle of his posture, letting his spine lengthen as he rolled his shoulders back against the wall, easing tiny tensions he hadn't realized were there. The stool shifted under him with another faint, familiar creak, an old sound that belonged to this room as much as the hum or the soft rattle of distant vents. His gloved hands rested loosely atop his thighs now, fingers relaxed, palms warm from the air and from the subtle radiance that seemed to fill the space from floor to ceiling. The chamber's light sent a soft gleam across the edges of his gloves, outlining the curve of each knuckle in gold. He watched the glow for a moment, seeing how it changed when he lifted one hand slightly, how the light slid across the fabric and then returned to the fire brick, as if unwilling to linger too long anywhere but on the surfaces that had known it longest. There was something comforting in that, the idea that the bricks, the rails, the metal, and stone of this room had collected more nights than any single person ever could, that they held within them the steady, quiet record of every transformation the chamber had overseen. He let his head tilt to one side, cheek brushing the coolness of the wall behind him. The contrast between the cold of the wall and the warm air in front of him sharpened his awareness of the heat without jarring it. It made the warmth feel deeper, more enveloping, the way a blanket feels heavier and more comforting when the air outside it cools. His eyes softened, the edges of his vision blurring just enough that the chamber's interior looked like a single, glowing shape rather than a collection of bricks and rails and light. And in that gentle blur, the familiar thought rose again, not in words, not in a sentence, but in a feeling that he could have translated at any time to the same quiet idea. After the burn, what remains? He didn't chase it. He simply let the feeling hover, a soft outline at the edge of awareness, while his attention drifted back to the hum, the warmth, the subtle shimmer in the air. There was always something left when the heat retreated. He knew that much, not just the physical traces that the world might name and measure, but the quieter remnants that belonged only to rooms like this. The softened memory in the brick, the faint impressions in the metal, the way the air felt different after a cycle completed. As if it had learned something it couldn't put into language. He blinked slowly, and when his eyes opened again, he realized he had lost track of how long he'd been sitting there, watching, breathing, listening, and it didn't matter. The long watch was not about counting. It was about accompanying the process, being present for the slow unfolding and the steady holding. He stood up with care so as not to startle his own muscles out of the relaxed state they had settled into, and he moved forward until he stood once more at the edge of the chamber's threshold. From here, the warmth was deeper, like standing near the edge of a calm, heated pool at night. The rail reflections trembled gently along the floor, the kind of trembling that suggests constant motion without noise. And the fire brick interior glowed in layers, brighter along the lower edges, softer near the top, where the heat thinned into air. Cole rested his hand against the outer frame again, feeling the heat that had grown beneath his earlier touch, and he allowed himself a final long inhale, filling his lungs not only with warmth, but with the quiet assurance that everything was unfolding as it should. He exhaled slowly, his breath vanishing into the chamber's radiance, and stepped back once more, returning to the stool, resuming his silent post as the long watch continued. There was nothing more to adjust for now, nothing to correct, nothing to hurry, just the slow, steady work of heat and time, of brick and metal, of hum and breath. And so he stayed there, held gently in the warm, patient light, listening to the chamber and the building and the night, all speaking the same wordless language of slow endurance, until all that existed in his awareness was the quiet rise and fall of the room's invisible pulse and the soft, unhurried rhythm of his own breathing, moving in perfect time with the glow. The hours that followed did not arrive with any dramatic shift, no sudden change of sound or temperature, only the quiet settling that always came after the chamber reached its steady rhythm, a long plateau of warmth where everything inside the room existed in a kind of suspended calm. And Cole, who had long ago learned the shape of that calm, felt it wrap around him like a familiar blanket, as if the building itself had exhaled fully and was now resting in the soft, ember-lit part of the night. He sat for a while longer on the stool, watching the slow, unhurried glow inside the chamber, the way the light no longer seemed to be rising or building, but simply holding, resting within the bricks and rails as if reluctant to move on. And his breathing followed that same pattern, no longer ascending, no longer adjusting, just quietly staying, matched to the room's steady pulse. The hum beneath his boots had softened again, still present, still continuous, but rounder, less insistent, like a sound remembered more than heard. And if he closed his eyes, he could feel it as a faint vibration deep in his ribs, a background rhythm that expected nothing from him except this: to stay, to witness, to be there while the heat did its work. Time in the ember hours did not feel like hours at all. It felt like one long, gentle stretch of now, without edges, without the usual markers that divided night from morning. Cole stood eventually, the stool releasing him with that same small creak it always offered, and he walked to the edge of the chamber's threshold again, letting the warmth that still poured from within lap gently against his shins and waist, like the last lingering waves of a tide that had reached its furthest point and was now beginning the slow journey back. The bricks glowed less brightly now, their colors deepened into muted shades of amber and rust. The earlier intensity softened into something quieter, more reflective, and the air, though still warm, no longer pressed outward. It simply lingered, as if reluctant to entirely let go of what it had been holding. Cole rested his gloved hand against the frame, feeling the difference there too. The heat beneath his palm was no longer climbing. It had leveled and begun to descend in almost imperceptible degrees, a gradual easing that felt like a long-held breath, finally starting to fade. He watched the interior light shift by the faintest margin, saw how the shimmering distortion in the air weakened into a thinner veil, saw how the rail's subtle glow dulled into a steady, quieter tone. It was always at this point, a point some might have called the end, but which he had long ago stopped thinking of in such terms, that the question, the same one that had followed him through the hallways and rooms and rituals of the night, returned with a softness so familiar it felt less like a thought and more like an old friend laying a hand on his shoulder. After the burn, what remains? He did not try to phrase an answer. The room, as always, did it for him in ways that did not require words. What remained was here, in the warm, dim quiet of the chamber room, as it gently released its heat back into the air. In the soft hum that continued even as the temperature fell, in the way the bricks held onto a faint glow longer than they needed to, as though honoring what they had just carried. What remained was in his own body, in the looseness of his shoulders, in the ease of his breath, in the way his thoughts had thinned into something gentle and light, stripped of edges by hours spent inside warmth that asked for nothing but patience. He stepped back from the door and moved to the control panel, resting his hand on its surface for a moment, before adjusting the settings with the same slow precision he had used to raise them. The pressure gauge began its downward path, the needle gliding along the arc in the other direction now, its movement no less patient, no less calm. The timer approached its final markings, the small pointer creeping toward rest, and as Cole watched, he felt the whole room subtly reorient, from action into aftermath, from transformation into settling. The sound of the chamber followed suit. The rich, resonant hum began to soften into something smaller, thinner, like a song reaching its last notes and choosing to fade rather than stop. The interior light dimmed in stages as he lowered it, each adjustment shrinking the glow until the bricks looked less like molten embers and more like warmed stone, their surfaces still touched by heat but no longer illuminated from within. Shadows returned gradually to their corners, gathering again at the thresholds and along the rails. But they did so without sharpness, without intrusion. They were gentle shadows, ones that seemed to carry their own quiet respect for what the light had done. The warmth in the air shifted too, redistributing itself from a concentrated core into a more even diffused layer that filled the room without radiating so insistently from the chamber. Cole moved one hand slowly through that air, feeling how it no longer flowed as a rising current, but hung like a thin veil, still softer and warmer than the hallways beyond, but clearly beginning its slow surrender to the cooler spaces waiting outside this room. He turned away briefly and walked to the far wall, where the small rectangular window looked out into the corridor. Beyond it, the lights were dimmer now, operating in their late-night mode, stretched thin along the floor like faint trails rather than full washes. The rest of the building slept in its own way, its quiet layered and deep, and this room, with its ember-warm air and slow-dropping hum, felt like the last island of full wakefulness in a sea of soft, drifting dark. He returned to the chamber door for one final pause before closing it, letting his hand rest on the edge as he peered into the dim interior. The glow was faint now, just enough to outline the curves of the fire brick and the straight lines of the rails in muted amber, and the air inside moved only in delicate waves, as if the heat were whispering its farewells to the stone that had held it. Cole allowed himself a long, steady breath in that doorway, inhaling the last, gentlest trace of the night's work, and as he exhaled, he felt the earlier question resolve itself not into a sentence, but into a feeling so simple he did not need to say it aloud. What remains after the burn is never absence. It is a softer version of what was, a quieter shape, a smaller warmth, a kind of stillness that has laid down all its weight. He closed the chamber door with infinite care, guiding it inward until the seal met with only the mildest thud, a sound cushioned by gaskets and time and the softness of the hour. The hum behind the door continued, muted now, thin but persistent, a reminder that even in rest, the chamber's heart never fully stopped. Cole stood in front of the closed door for a few seconds longer, his hand still on the handle, and then let it fall back to his side as he turned away, carrying the room's residual warmth with him as he walked toward the control panel to complete the last steps of shutdown. He moved through those motions almost without thought, though not without attention, his hands adjusting dials, confirming readings, setting systems to their long, slow cool, each action as calm and deliberate as everything that had come before. The panel lights shifted from active glow to a quieter, resting state, their brightness reduced to simple indicators, small, steady points in the warm dim of the room. Somewhere beneath the floor, airflow adjusted in response, the faint rush thinning into a sigh, and the vibrations under his boots settled into a gentler frequency that barely registered at the edge of perception. When the final check was done, when the gauges all sat where they needed to sit, and the timers had finished their silent circling, Cole stepped away from the panel and let his gaze sweep the room one last time. The chamber stood still and quiet now, its door closed, its warmth folding slowly inward. The rails were no longer bright, the floor no longer shimmering, yet the memory of heat remained in the air like a scent, like a story told without words. His shoulders felt looser than they had at the start of the night. His breath moved easily, with no strain, no effort, and his hands, still in their gloves, hung peacefully at his sides. He walked toward the door that led back into the hallway, the soles of his boots making soft contact with the floor, each step accompanied by the faint echo of the chamber's fading hum behind him. When he reached the threshold, he placed his hand on the door frame exactly as he had when he entered, fingers resting against the metal with a light, steady pressure. And he let the contrast between the lingering warmth of the room and the cooler air beyond sink into his awareness. One last breath in, filled with fire brick, metal, and the memory of heat. One last breath out, carrying with it any remnants of strain or thought that did not need to follow him. Then he opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, where the light was slimmer, cooler, stretched in quiet strips along the floor. The air here felt lighter, thinner, like a different kind of quiet waiting to receive him. And as the door to the chamber room eased shut at his back, the sound of it closing folded neatly into the silence of the corridor, as gentle and final as the last page of a book being laid flat. Cole began the familiar walk toward the exit, each step unhurried, each breath steady. And though the warmth of the chamber receded with distance, a softer warmth remained inside him, one that hummed quietly beneath his ribs, gentle and enduring. In the end, he thought, not in words, but in that drifting half-sleep way of late hours, what remains after any burn, after any long watch, after any deep heat, is not the blaze itself, but the stillness that follows it, the quiet that has learned something from the fire and chosen to stay, gentler, lighter, less burdened than before. And as he walked through the dim-lit hallways toward the outer door, leaving the building to its own deep structural sleep, that same kind of stillness settled over him, around him, within him, so that by the time he reached the night air outside, the world felt softer, farther, quieter, as if all its edges had been filed down to something smooth. Somewhere very far away from him, in other rooms and other lives, someone might be asking their own version of the same question he had carried all night, the one about what remains after heat, after endings, after long silent processes no one sees. Here, in this narrow crossing between warmth and cool, between work and rest, his body offered the only answer that mattered: loosened breath, slower pulse, a mind that had set its weight down. Far above, the sky held its own stillness, a dark, vast quiet that did not press but hovered. And as Cole moved through the hush of the outside, his steps soft on the ground, the last echoes of the chamber's warmth fading into memory, the night itself seemed to whisper the same invitation it offered every time he left, an invitation not to think, not to solve, but simply to drift, to rest, to let whatever remained become lighter with each passing breath. And somewhere in another quiet room, someone listening to all of this could feel their own thoughts loosening, their own body softening, their own night settling into that same gentle space where nothing urgent remained, and everything that did remain was finally, quietly allowed to rest.